Once upon a time, the man had been her whole world. Now, quietly knocking on the door, the girl waited for permission to enter. But no invitation came. Holding a tray of freshly brewed tea in front of her, the brunette opened the door and boldly entered her husband's office. However, the Duke, sitting at the table, did not react. He was clearly not happy about her visit. Continuing to look through the letters, the blonde asked without much interest about what had happened. Clutching a tray on which stood a pot-bellied teapot, she announced with a strained smile that she would like to have tea with him, affectionately calling him Edric. And the Duke, without looking up, said that it would be better to do it later. But the wife promised that she would not take up much of her husband's time. A thin man with glasses that had slipped down to the tip of his nose, he grumbled discontentedly that the girl was being especially stubborn today. Despite his reluctance to see the brunette, he reluctantly offered her to sit down, doing so as if he was fulfilling a duty rather than showing concern. Loudly putting the tray down on the table, she felt growing irritation. This indifference had long hurt her pride, and therefore the beauty could hardly contain her emotions. Sitting down on the sofa and folding her hands on her knees, the brunette waited with restraint for him to join in, hoping for at least a short conversation. Time flew by, and it became clear that he seemed to have forgotten about her presence, completely immersed in papers. While leafing through the documents and taking notes, Edric paid no attention to his wife, as if there was no one in the room, and the aromatic tea with yellow flower petals, left on the table, slowly cooled down, losing its warmth. The pen quietly scratched across the paper, and the man, completely absorbed in his work, corrected the letter. However, soon the young man called his servant and demanded that it be sent to the addressee immediately, and the wife, finishing her tea, understood that drinking tea together was cancelled for today, because the blonde man didn't even make an attempt to sit down next to her. Gathering her strength, she hurried to ask an important question. But the man, hurrying the beauty, already demanded to get to the point because he complained of fatigue. Coming closer, the brunette nervously asked why the man married her. Edric abruptly took off his glasses and looked closely at the woman he once loved. Her hands were shaking, and now his wife was reminding him that 5 years ago she had given up her dream and devoted herself to him, hoping to be loved. With despair in her voice, the brunette said that if everything remained as it was, then she saw no point in continuing this marriage. However, the man had already said that he had married for love, but it sounded dry and even a little formal. There was no hope in her gaze. The woman's face had long since ceased to glow with happiness, but it seemed that the Duke had only just realized this. But soon, a little more quietly, he admitted that he had thought it was love then. But now, he was not so sure. Perhaps there was no love between them. After all, they were from different worlds. But often in the evening, crumpling the fabric of her dress, she cried bitterly, realizing that she could not change anything. For 5 years, since she became a duchess, the girl asked for forgiveness. And now, sitting on the floor and looking at the documents that the brunette was holding in her hands, she asked for forgiveness for the fact that she herself decided to turn away and leave him. But the next moment, touching the window, outside which the rain was pouring, she suddenly realized that she had addressed her apologies to the wrong person. Looking at her reflection in the glass and shedding tears, she understood that she needed to ask herself for forgiveness. After all, the girl did not accept herself as she really was, and the memories carried the brunette to where 5 years ago the empire, spread out at the foot of the mountains, seemed like paradise to her. After all, back then the girl believed in a bright future. The beautiful mansion, which stood surrounded by other buildings, seemed like a palace, and its blue roof was sometimes envied by the sky. Passers-by often thought about who lived there while walking along the neat paving stones, and the children thought that a princess lived there. In fact, the house belonged to the Felton family, and the girl who often went out for a walk and attracted attention was only a guest there. The children stopped and asked their parents to wait, because they wanted to take a closer look at the beauty with the reserved smile and long hair. However, she did not look like a princess. After all, her dress and the sad umbrella in her hands, which hid her from the sun, indicated that the girl was not rich. Melly Enwood had lived in this mansion for quite some time, and she was not of noble birth at all. As she opened her umbrella to protect herself from the scorching sun, she overheard passers-by whispering that perhaps it was not a princess who lived in this house, but a prince. But the next moment, she already heard a familiar voice behind her, asking where she was heading without warning. It was Edric Ryan Felton, the owner of the mansion and a true jewel of the family. A tall and stately young man, in a perfectly fitting suit on a perfect figure, was well-educated and well-mannered. And now he was calling her. After apologizing, Melly said that she would not want to disturb him if he stayed. But the man, approaching, sharply objected and asked her not to say that again. Stroking the girl on the head, he reminded her with a smile that she was like a little sister to him. And Melly, blushing, looked away, upset by these words. But suddenly, looking under her frilly umbrella, he very gently asked the beauty for a favor, which immediately perked her up. Clutching the handle of the accessory tighter, she was already happy that she could be useful to him that day. Walking with Edric through the shady garden of the mansion, the brunette remembered how 10 years ago she was left homeless after the death of her mother and found shelter here. At the time, her mother and Edric's mother, the former Duchess of Felton, were friends. So Melly became part of their lives, raised as one of their own. She grew up next to this kind and caring young man, becoming more and more attached to him. But with age, she realized that she was still just a guest. Now, as an adult, she thought more and more often about how much she wanted Edric to love her. And she was ready to fulfill any request he made. But a luxurious white carriage with gilded decorations and flowers, as if torn from a fairy tale, approaching the courtyard, was already interrupting their plans. The wheels creaked and it stopped abruptly. Melly knew who had arrived, and this fact only upset the girl. Edric stopped, and the brunette, looking around, was already in a hurry to examine the one who would soon become the bride of the man whom the beauty loved so much. Felton walked quickly to the gate and asked Melly to wait a bit. Left alone, the girl clutched the umbrella with all her might. Her hopes were collapsing. After all, standing under an umbrella, in the flow of wind, she understood that the place she had once counted on would soon be occupied, and the young man was already hurrying to offer his hand to the dazzling blonde in a luxurious dress, whose jewelry shamelessly sparkled in the daylight. And soon the guest was received in the elegant blue reception hall. And Edric was already talking about how he wanted to introduce her to Lady Melly Enwood, who was like a younger sister to him. Looking at the blonde who was sitting opposite her, the girl smiled reservedly and politely said that she was glad to meet her. And the seemingly sweet guest, smiling radiantly, was already telling her that her name was Rosalina Adele, and that she too was very glad to meet him. But the lady present at dinner, Edric's mother, was already in a hurry to tell the girl's difficult story. After all, Ada had been taking care of her since she lost her mother. Looking at Rosalina, the woman sincerely admitted that she was glad to meet such a worthy girl. And the guest, covering her mouth with her hand, quietly thanked him for the warm words. And Melly, lowering her eyes, thought about how Rosalina had unexpectedly quickly won the sympathy and affection of Edric's mother. But what struck her even more was how similar she and the blonde were in their facial features, manner of speaking, and softness of gaze. Words about marriages made in heaven floated through the air, and now, more than ever, they seemed appropriate. And Edric, without taking his eyes off the blonde, looked at her. And the brunette, clasping her hands, was upset. After all, she had no idea that Edric was really preparing for marriage. But the next moment, Ada turned to Melly, reminding the girl to also think about a worthy partner. Looking at her, the brunette thought she had misheard. But Ada had already continued, saying that the head of the Blair Company had been showing interest in her for a long time. But the woman, smiling, advised to meet him. Despite the age difference, she emphasized that he was a respected, honest, and very serious person. As Melly stabbed a tomato with a fork, she thought only that she essentially had no choice. After all, only this family could make all the decisions that concerned her. Closing her eyes, she quietly replied that she would think about the offer, trying not to show her irritation. And Edric, keeping up the conversation, added that he would definitely find a suitable match for his younger sister, trying to smooth things over. Raising the glass to his mouth, he confidently said that there was no need to worry. After all, he would try to resolve this issue very soon. Looking up at him with tear-filled eyes, Melly couldn't believe her ears. And Ada, reminding him that she knows how caring her son is, considers his interference unnecessary. But he, tapping his finger on the table, was already enthusiastically making plans. After all, after the wedding with Rosalina, he was going to invite Melly to their southern province. It was warm there, even in winter, and Edric knew where Melly would be comfortable. He was sure that the girl would be calm, far from the bustle of the capital. But from the brunetta's look, it was obvious that she didn't like all this at all. She frowned, tensed up, and began to get noticeably nervous. However, the atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by a sharp bang, causing everyone to turn their gaze to Rosalina. Smiling, the guest said that she had left something important in the carriage, and said that she had to go get it. And Edric immediately perked up, trying to be gallant and offering to take the girl, which especially upset Melly, who was watching this. But Rosalina gently replied that it was of no use, and he, embracing the Marquise's daughter and beaming with joy, was already escorting her to the door. The loud slamming of the door scared Melly. She didn't want to believe that all this was happening for real and wasn't a dream. Citing a headache, and without even touching the meat, she apologized and said she needed to go out. As Melly walked down the long corridor, all she could think about was that she had lied. Even though the pain was real, the reason for leaving was something completely different. She held her head, hoping to catch her breath a little in the fresh air. But suddenly, she heard a woman's laughter coming from the other end of the corridor. And looking closely, she already saw two people bustling around the corner. The girl begged the man not to touch her, saying that someone might see them. Melly immediately recognized Rosalina, but she was surprised by the intonation of her voice, because it was quite sharp. The brunette tried to understand who the man was, with whom the guest was so angry. Melly was afraid that she would become a witness to a secret that no one was supposed to know. But looking into the distance, she saw that Rosalina was enjoying herself in the arms of another man. Their kisses were so loud that only a deaf person would not hear. She pressed her hands to her lips to keep from screaming and stood frozen for a moment in shock. But turning around, she was already hurriedly walking away. Her sick head could not comprehend what had just appeared before her eyes. The thought that Rosalind had a lover pounded in her head like a hammer. She couldn't understand how Felton's fiancé could behave like this. It was so shameful that she couldn't even imagine it. Her soul screamed and her heart ached for the one who knew nothing. She wanted to tell him everything, but suddenly she stopped, hearing her name being called. And in the rays of light, she already saw her beloved man. Doubts were already battling in her head whether she should tell Edric the truth. However, the young man who came closer was already asking where the girl was rushing to, but Melly understood that this was the only way she could act. She burst into tears and began to speak. Words that seemed terrible to the brunette came out of her mouth. After all, Rosalina had committed adultery with another man. Telling everything as it was, she could not hold back her tears. After all, inside there was a certainty that Edric should know the whole truth. The man's face turned pale, and his eyes clouded over. He was clearly trying to comprehend what was said, but he couldn't find the words to respond. At some point, Melly realized that she had hurt the person she loved, but it was too late to retreat, because the words had already been spoken. He looked at her, and then, exhaling as if he had made an internal decision, he came closer to her. In his opinion, marriage and love were different things. But the man continued, declaring that he was not going to interfere in Rosalina's relationship with someone else. Holding out his hand, he softly said that he would feel calm next to her, and his future wife would not mind if Melly stayed in the house even after the wedding. The brunette couldn't imagine how they would be able to live under the same roof after he got married. She couldn't understand how she would be able to hide her feelings for Edric, and then calmly watch the couple smile, hold hands, and hug as if she doesn't exist. The girl won't be able to. After all, it will break her heart. Melly's hands began to tremble. Unable to remain silent any longer, she hurried to say that all this was wrong, and that she would try to find a partner and leave. But the next moment, he was already firmly holding her hand, and something strange appeared in his gaze. Edric did not want the brunette to talk about his future marriage. Looking at the girl with confusion, he asked her not to take his mother's words seriously. After all, the brunette had absolutely no need to obey her. However, watching him, Melly did not understand why this question bothered him so much. Did he really just feel sorry for her as a younger sister, the girl thought? But the guy was already saying that they were best friends, although his face was flushed. Holding the hands of the beauty, he confessed that the thought that she would feel bad made him uneasy. He asked her to stay, without unnecessary words and promises. Gently touching her hand with his lips, Edric hoped for understanding. After all, he knew that she always did as he asked her. And now the Duke asked her to believe him to the end, and the girl already understood that every time she looked into his blue eyes, she had no strength left for anything except obediently nodding in response. But now, when he had not let go of her hand for so long, she clearly realized that Edric was more than just a friend to her. After all, she loved him more than anyone in the world, and the memories already carried the girl away to that snowy winter evening. The shaggy snow, falling on the roofs of the houses, turned everything around into a magical but cold fairy tale. The mother's hand held the baby tightly, and she felt a barely perceptible warmth emanating from the warm palm, despite the freezing air. The terrible cold wind, biting at the cheeks, invigorated, and the baby's breath turned into thick clouds of steam, dissolving in the frosty air. Her legs ached from the long walk, but the walk gave the girl a strange pleasure, as if something important awaited them ahead. That day, her mother looked excited, and the girl heard the tremor in her voice when she said that very soon they would come to their new home. Hiding her lips in a terracotta scarf, she did not understand what was being said. But her mother repeated with a smile that everything would be fine. However, the next moment the girl's heart sank in surprise. After all, what she imagined as a home looked like a real palace. Stopping at the open gates of the luxurious mansion, they were taken aback by the grandeur of the building, which seemed unreal. A stately blonde, with a skinny boy standing next to her, greeted her mother with a warm voice. And Jasmine, holding her frozen daughter's hand, was clearly grateful to her. Looking out from behind her mother, she already saw her future friend for many years. And her mother, encouraging the girl, asked her to introduce herself. After all, the future Duke of Felton stood before her. Despite her age, the girl noted how politely and elegantly the teenager bowed to her mother. Maintaining formalities, he asked how tired they were from the journey. Smiling slightly, the teenager invited them to feel at home, as if he knew how important it was for these people to hear such words now. She remembered this moment for the rest of her life. After all, she had never heard such words before, and the next moment she was already saying that her name was Melly Enwood. And she also felt how warm it was inside her. They quickly became close. They had no one closer to each other, and they tried to spend all their free time together, often running around the park. Edric trusted Melly with all his secrets, and sitting on the shore of the lake, he told her what he hid from everyone. He often and sincerely laughed, trying to cheer up a slightly sad Melly. And in response, she simply listened and nodded, afraid to scare away this warmth. One day he gave the girl a diary for notes, tied with a beautiful ribbon. Helping her mother, Melly dreamed that this friendship would last forever. But her mother, hanging out the laundry, reminded her that she and Edric were from different worlds, and her daughter should not forget about it. By warning her that the young man was living in a world that did not belong to them, she did not want the girl to develop illusions. While putting the laundry in the basket, she listened attentively to her mother, trying to remember everything. After all, little Melly knew that her mother was the daughter of a famous count. However, fate turned out so that the woman lived an unhappy life in marriage. And now the little girl realized that she was the daughter of a poor aristocrat, forced to live in someone else's house as a guest. While writing down the best moments of her life and her mother's advice in her diary, Melly understood that her mother was asking her not to ruin her destiny by making the wrong choice. She remembered these words forever. And although she and Edric lived in different worlds, he always remained in her thoughts and diary entries. Melly knew she had to keep her feelings bottled up, not letting them spill out and destroy everything around her. Returning to her room and opening her favorite diary, she could not understand what Edric really wanted from her, but he described what she wanted. It seemed that he himself could not break the invisible bond that held them together, and that is why he made such strange proposals. A sudden knock on this door interrupted her thoughts. She immediately recognized the familiar voice coming from outside. The Duchess, who entered the room, looked sweetly at the girl and was already asking if Melly had a free minute. Meanwhile, in the Marquis's house, where Edric was invited as a guest, cheerful laughter was already heard. After all, Rosalina admired how beautiful Duke Felton looked. Having thanked her for the compliment, the young man asked how her father was feeling. However, the girl replied that her father was often away and her mother was never at home. But Edric noted that high rank obliges one to do many things, and perhaps after the wedding, they too will rarely see each other. Rosalina, smiling slightly, agreed with his conclusions, while glancing sideways at the grape that the young man who had come up behind her was holding out. The girl's tone became more and more frivolous and provocative when she, laughing, noted that she and Edric really understood each other perfectly. Covering her mouth with her hand, the beauty added that this is precisely why people strive to find a partner similar to themselves, which promotes love. But the young man heard the falsehood in her words. After all, he saw perfectly well how she openly flirted with her lover, not even trying to hide it. He knew Francis Adele well, the young man who accompanied Rosaline everywhere. They were introduced as relatives, but the man did not believe in such formalities. After all, the Marquise, having no direct heir, nominated Francis as his successor. But Edric was sure that only she could have given the expensive ring on the young man's finger. Despite the claims of brotherly bonding, it was obvious that there had long been passion between them. Their touches became more and more explicit, as if they were not afraid of witnesses at all. But sooner or later, Francis would have to break up with her. Being a pragmatist, the Duke was already making plans on how he could turn the current situation to his advantage. After all, he knew how to exploit weakness like no one else. And now, touching his fingers to the cup of tea, he understood why the thought of Melly staying close was becoming more and more desirable. At this point, Rosalina, having dissolved in the guy's arms, was already interested in how Melly was feeling. After all, she noted that the girl looked upset, trying to remain calm, although at this time Francis almost openly kissed the girl. He reminded her that she would live with them. But this answer was not enough for Rosaline, and already looking slyly at Edric, she asked whether the man would like to build the same kind of relationship with the brunette as she had with Francis. Edric froze. He blushed slightly and was clearly in no hurry to answer, knowing full well that telling the truth in this situation would be dangerous. But a second later, the Duke, with a slight smile, reminded him that Melly was like a younger sister to him, and therefore they could have nothing but friendship. But it seemed that the Marquise did not believe his words, because doubt was visible in her gaze. She wanted to know if she was really his lover. However, Edric explained that Melly had been his friend since childhood, and Rosalina, squinting, noted that sooner or later she would have to get married and leave his house. It was obvious that it was painful for Edric to think about it, and looking down, he calmly said that they should not rush into her future at all. Now he was thinking about how, upon returning home, the first thing he would do would be to ask Melly to brew his favorite tea for him, and the strange couple was already wishing the Duke a safe journey. However, sitting in the carriage and propping his cheek with his hand, Edric could not get the image of the brunette out of his head. After all, he caught himself thinking that he needed more than just her tea. At the same time, his mother's words were also spinning around in his head. After all, as soon as he introduced Rosaline to her, she had already started talking about Melly's future and her imminent wedding, hurrying to send her away as far as possible. Entering the family mansion, he handed the briefcase to the assistant with a familiar movement, and the young man was interested in how the event went. Taking off his cloak, Edric asked to call Melly urgently. However, she was not at home, and the assistant's answer caught him by surprise. After all, he politely reported that the brunette had left about an hour ago, and apparently she had been taken to a meeting with the Lord, which had been organized by the Duchess. The Duke turned around abruptly, not hiding his surprise. His mother had acted too quickly, as if everything had been planned in advance, and he had no idea how far Ada had gone. Returning to Edric's past, it could be said that from a very young age he was drawn to knowledge. Games with teenagers did not interest him, and he always avoided them. While his classmates were running around the yard, shouting and fooling around, Edric sat on a bench, crossing out and rewriting his calculations. The teenager with glasses that kept slipping off his nose belonged to the famous Felton family, and from the age of 13, he considered his peers to be underdeveloped. Even at this age, he understood that connections were the most important thing in society, and therefore saw no point in wasting his time on snotty boys. He was left alone more and more often, but Edric loved solitude. After all, it gave him time for reflection, analysis, and his little plans. But conversations with adults brought him real pleasure, especially if they touched on politics or strategy, and the teenager loved helping his father in the office. There were days when boredom turned into irritation, and then he would sneakily throw a stone at the boys' heads, in order to cause a storm of emotions and relieve the air. After all, having screamed, they turned around sharply and tried to figure out who did it. But they had no idea that the real culprit was watching them. He dreamed that one day he would make the Felton name so great that even the most stupid teenagers would be forced to bow before him and his abilities. Even then, he tried to think about how to build political steps, and also to manage not only the house, but the whole country. He knew that his father bowed too much before the emperor, and this quality prevented their line from becoming truly strong, Edric believed. It seemed to him that behind the grandeur of the throne and the mask of imperial power, there was only profit, control, and farce, and he did not want to be part of this game. Looking at the teenagers beating each other up, he understood that human weaknesses can manifest themselves when the situation is provoked. Such an outburst of aggression seemed to charge him from within, and throwing another stone, he felt satisfaction, as if he controlled their actions. But this time, a quiet and pleasant voice stopped him. He tensed up when he heard someone quite confidently asking him not to do that again. Turning around, he looked with interest at the girl standing on the edge of the path. He was amazed by the courage with which she spoke about it. And now he could not believe his eyes. After all, such a small and fragile girl had revealed his plan. Looking at the girl, he felt that there was something strangely familiar in her face. It was surprising that he had not noticed her in the house before, or simply did not want to notice her. After all, it was Melly who had moved into their estate with her mother a few months ago, and although she was always there, Edric seemed to erase her from his reality. He demanded an explanation, asking what he had done. But the girl again repeated, with restraint, that it was he who had thrown the stone. And now the teenager was terribly curious as to why she decided to intervene instead of sitting quietly. But it seemed that the girl did not care what he thought of her. With the same confidence, she again declared that she knew who did it, and she was not mistaken. However, Edric was already remembering how much younger she was than him. It seemed like the age difference was about 3 years, but she spoke to him as an equal. The calm and deep brown eyes of the brunette captivated the teenager, depriving him of arrogance. And now he understood that Melly was completely different from the other guys, and the ambitious Edric even thought that he could be friends with her. Very soon he prepared a gift for the brave beauty, and the notebook with monograms, tied with a blue ribbon, looked unusually elegant. This strange relationship began with curiosity, but there was already something more in it. In her face, he saw intelligence and honesty that fascinated the teenager, and she happily wrote down in her notebook what Edric advised to read and her feelings from the conversations. The brunette tried to imitate him, and this won him over. It seemed that outwardly nothing had changed between them, but each of them thought about the other more and more often. Their attention to each other was becoming a habit. As soon as they were alone, the masks were thrown off, and they turned back into children who were simply happy to be around. But time flew by inexorably. Melly's attitude towards the Duke had hardly changed, except that she had fallen in love with him with all her heart. And she kept this love as a treasure. However, he, often sitting on the shore of the lake and throwing stones into the water, thought with sadness that the girl no longer seemed special to him. As Edric walked along the cobblestones, he reflected that now they both no longer had to pretend to be adults. Adulthood had just come upon them. Even though Melly was no longer suitable, he still felt affection and duty, and that was why he wanted to take care of her. And now, looking at the upset brunette, he reminded himself that Rosalina had already agreed to let Melly stay with them after the wedding. As he crossed the park, Edric knew he was pursuing his own goal. He was sure that when he reached the top, he would need a companion who would soberly evaluate him. And now, when Melly was moving after him, he thought only about the fact that only here, next to him, was the brunette's real place. Because he decided so, and because he wanted it, and also because it was convenient and profitable for him. But his assistant had already reported that the former Duchess had arranged a meeting between Melly and a potential groom, and Edric felt an internal tension. After all, just recently, he asked the girl not to listen to her mother, assuring her that the woman was mistaken and had no right to interfere in her fate. Tearing off his tie and throwing off his coat, he was already heading towards her room. Realizing that if Melly took this step, he would lose not only his childhood friend, but also his balance. But the brunette was not going to waste time. After all, she had already come to meet a middle-aged man, who, putting his hand to his chest, said that he was glad to meet her. Lord Blair knew about her from the stories of the former Duchess of Felton, and it seemed that he was not lying, and the girl only carefully examined her interlocutor. After the man's words, she was already interested in what Ada could tell. What details were passed on behind her back, and why it mattered, Melly guessed. However, the man claimed that despite the fall of the girl's family, there was still noble blood in it, and this could benefit his cause. And now the brunette thought about how much information Ada had told about her. But suddenly smiling, she realized that this was quite in her style. And the man, quoting the former Duchess, noted that she could not remain dependent in this house forever. Therefore, he offered her a place where the girl could be useful. Watching the man quickly cut the meat, she realized that he had strong and confident hands, which spoke of his good health. But the lord did not want to beat around the bush and was already inviting her to live in his house. And what was especially nice was that the girl's dowry did not matter to him. Melly felt like she was being bought as she clutched the hem of her dress. It was a disgusting feeling, because she felt like no one cared about her feelings. And suddenly, she remembered Ayla's words about him being a good man. Holding her hands, the lady assured her that Lord Blair would be able to fulfill the promise he had given to her mother. But now, lowering her head, Melly suddenly thought that it was unlikely that the former Duchess actually knew what kind of person this lord was and what motivated him. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but there was no point in being offended. After all, the world had long since ceased to be kind to her, and it was naive to count on sympathy. And only after returning home did she feel completely helpless. Her head ached, and all she wanted now was peace and quiet. Entering the room, the brunette fell exhausted onto the bed. She loved this house, and only here could she feel warmth and safety. However, the next moment, her ear caught a familiar voice, and Derek was already scolding her with reproach for the fact that the girl had returned too late. He stretched his hands to her hair, gently fingering the curls. And the girl trembled from fatigue and inner emptiness. And of course, he was in a hurry to ask how Melly spent the evening. After all, his plans were to destroy her empty hopes and bring the girl back into his life. However, jumping up, the brunette was already asking what Edric was doing here. But he was just waiting and worried about her. The young man answered smiling. Looking tenderly at Melly, he wanted to hear the details of the meeting with Lord Blair. He did not insist, giving her the opportunity to speak out. However, his good mood made the girl nervous. After all, she thought that the Duke would be upset because the girl did not listen to him. While adjusting her dress, the girl was already saying that everything had not gone as badly as she had expected. But this was not enough, and he asked for more details. And the girl had already said that Lord Blair was a commoner who was lucky with his fortune and title. However, it seemed that Edric was no longer listening to her. After all, the next moment he declared that he himself would find her the ideal candidate. Looking down, Melly thought that the ideal candidate was now sitting right in front of her, and it was unlikely that anyone could compare to him. And yet the brunette said that she would like to meet Lord Blair again. But Edric was angry and asked to stop talking about this topic. He smiled strangely, as if he was about to say something else. However, he could not find the right words. But softly touching Amali's hand, he was already calmly saying that the man was not suitable for her. After all, he understood the Lord's intentions, and he did not like them. And the next words sounded cruel. After all, continuing to stroke the girl's hand, Edric noted that no animal makes a choice based on calculation. Taking her hands in his, he continued to speak frankly about how Lord Blair valued in her only the status she inherited from her mother. And he also assumed that if a more profitable option appeared, the man would change his attitude towards her without hesitation. Edric saw that Melly was turning away, because she couldn't influence anything anyway. However, the young man asked to believe that he was acting solely in her interests. And to be even more convincing, quickly approaching her ear, he whispered that in the end, Melly had never really known men. Lost in thought and touching her cheek with her finger, the brunette thanked him for the advice and said that she would definitely think about it seriously. But a minute later, the man abruptly changed his mind, offering Melly to meet him again. However, if something goes wrong, he asks her to immediately abandon this idea. And now he was asking the girl again whether she had heard him or not. And Melly, huddled and thinking about something of her own, trying not to show her emotions. But as he left, he tried once again to make sure that she would really think about his advice, even though he didn't expect an immediate answer from her. It was obvious that Edric could not find the right words. Putting his hand on the door, he threw out fragments of phrases that no longer had any meaning. But suddenly turning around, he assumed that perhaps she had already made some decision. And not hearing an answer, he simply wished her good night. She felt her heart ache. After all, the young man would sometimes attract her, and then suddenly push the girl away, forgetting how skillfully he manipulated people. Falling onto the bed, she felt that she needed to catch her breath a little. Otherwise, she simply wouldn't be able to cope with what was going on inside. Her heart was beating so hard that the girl felt like she was going to die. But the brunette had no doubt that Edric didn't even notice. Putting her brush on her forehead, Melly remembered his touches and the soft whispers that still sounded in her head and caused excitement. But the very next moment, her intuition told her that it was better to stay away from Edric as much as possible. However, fate would have it that she very soon realized how right Edric was. After all, when talking to Ada, she did not understand where the contender for her heart had disappeared to. However, the former Duchess said that he had been so busy with work recently that he had even missed his own engagement. The girl did not understand how this was possible. After all, she knew that the man himself had planned a meeting with her this weekend. But Ada, hiding her gaze, had already admitted that he had chosen the daughter of the Earl of Harrington. And Melly was amazed by Edric's foresight. And although very little time had passed, the young man knew about it in advance. And now the brunetta was transported to a ball, where she once saw the Count's beautiful and passionate daughter. The striking appearance and uninhibited movements of the beauty attracted men's glances, and the girl's expensive outfits skillfully emphasized her status. In contrast, Melly seemed dull and inconspicuous. Putting herself in Lord Blair's shoes, she knew that she would probably choose that lady. There, on the shore of the lake, she remembered how Edric promised to find her a partner. But hugging Melly's knees, she doubted that such a person hardly existed. After all, she had only seen them together. But Ada already sympathized with her, and said that she would try to find another candidate for the girl. But the brunette had to wait a little. However, Melly did not consider it necessary to tell the Duchess that Edric had also offered his help, and was already about to leave. And the woman, blushing, regretted that she couldn't help her. And now she looked after the brunette with confusion. The luxurious fountain, throwing up jets of cool water, tried to be useful in hot weather. Sitting down on the bench, Melly became sad. After all, she was becoming more and more convinced that hardly anyone needed such a person. Enjoying the freshness of the water, she realistically assessed that an orphan with an incomprehensible title, a fragile body, and a timid character was of no interest to society at all. Covering her face with her hands, the brunette was ready to cry again, because Edric probably thought so too. That was why he didn't advise relying on Lord Blair. Remembering the words of her mother, who always reminded her that she was not Felton and should know her place in this house, the girl calmed down a little. But a familiar and dear voice pulled her out of her dark thoughts. Taking off his glove, Edric walked towards her with a light gait. He was glad to meet the girl who came out to get some air. Saying that he spent time at the stables, the young man was in a great mood. The Duke saw that the girl was upset, and now he asked Melly about what had happened. Looking down and adjusting her hair, she confessed that Lord Blair had abandoned her, declaring the Earl's daughter his bride. Edric blushed. It was obvious that he was starting to get nervous. Choosing his words, the young man did not understand how he could have committed such a mean act. Looking at the young man, she began to think that the problem was not in him, but in herself. But the Duke only grumbled that his mother did not understand people at all. At one point, he simply screamed that he had to take revenge on this bastard. After all, it was completely unacceptable for someone to deceive their Felton family. However, the brunette asked not to do this. But strangely enough, Edric quickly calmed down, and coming closer, he already agreed that Lord Blair was not worthy of his Melly. Sitting down on the bench, he asked how upset the girl was. And without waiting for an answer, he added that all this needed to be forgotten as quickly as possible. His tenderness was boundless, and the next moment he assured her that there was no need to worry, because the Felton house would never abandon her. However, the next moment, without hiding his emotions and even with some childish joy, He admitted that he was happy to see her next to him again. The Countess could not believe her ears. Lifting her skirt, the girl ran after her father, screaming. After all, she could not believe that her father had sold her to the old lord. However, he, not paying attention to his daughter, only coldly reported that their ship had sunk a week ago, and he could not do otherwise, because they had lost everything. Looking back at his daughter, he reminded her that only Blair could provide the necessary amount. However, the girl, without holding back her anger, reproached her father for entrusting the business to his younger brother. But my father asked not to even raise this issue. After all, according to tradition, the family business was always passed down through the male line, and he followed the established order. However, she did not give up, reminding her father that it was his own fault. After all, he knew that his son lacked the ability and character to run a business. The Count spoke bitterly about how he sometimes regretted that his daughter had not been born a man. But he immediately added that the wedding would still take place as planned. Falling to her knees, the girl laughed and cried hysterically. But her father was adamant. After all, stubbornness would not change anything, he reminded her, and Claire Harrington would get married. However, the next blow was especially cruel, and my father had already said that such an opportunity was organized by none other than Duke Felton himself. Unable to sleep, Melly tossed and turned all night, endlessly going over in her head everything she had heard from Edric. The girl could not understand why the Duke was so insistent that she stay in the Felton house. Her memory recalled the young man's beaming smile, and the words that from that moment on they would live together again. Melly didn't understand how this was possible, and now she refused. After the wedding, she was going to move to the southern estate with his mother. He gave her mind no peace. Not allowing her to relax, Edric seemed to throw up more and more new thoughts. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the girl felt everything in her head buzzing, as if thoughts were colliding with each other and giving her no peace. Trying to use someone to forget about Edric was a bad idea. Holding her head in her hand, she already knew that she had to give up on her plans for marriage. However, the next moment, stretching Melly thought that she had no other choice. After all, in the Empire, a noble lady always depended on the decisions of other people. And now the brunette understood that now she, like her mother once did, would have to ask to be a maid of honor to the former duchess. And if everything turns out as the brunette hoped, then one day she will be able to call this woman Mom. After all, coexisting with her will not be difficult. She had long wanted to thank the woman for what she had done for her. And now, as she dressed in front of the mirror, Melly felt incredibly lucky. But when she opened the door and left the room, she ran into Edric. And he, as if nothing had happened, smiled and said that today the girl got up quite early. He also offered to keep her company at breakfast, reminding her that his mother was already waiting for them there. A slight blush covered the girl's cheeks. After all, Melly had already noted that the young man was behaving exactly as before, and this made her soul feel lighter. Lately, he had become more attentive to her words and desires, and now was one of the few bright moments that the brunette treasured. They quickly entered the dining room, and the former duchess turned around and was genuinely happy, because the breakfast was already getting cold. Melly greeted the lady with a warm smile, and nothing at that moment foreshadowed trouble until everything changed in one short moment. Smiling, it was clear that the former duchess was about to talk to the girl about something important. And the next moment, Ada was talking about the Duke, informing her that the girl was going to move south with her. Melly's cutlery hung in midair, but pulling herself together and smiling, the girl confirmed that she had indeed planned to do so. However, she did not yet understand what was wrong with this statement, and the lady, looking closely at the brunette, was already asking why she thought she had the right to make such decisions for her. At that moment, Melly felt as if the woman had been replaced. She couldn't believe her own ears, but Ada had already said that it was time for the girl to find a groom and not cling to her. Finishing her drink, the duchess almost whispered that the brunette's mother was her friend, but that doesn't make her a mother to the girl, and she shouldn't take care of her anymore. Wiping his mouth with a napkin, Edric stole glances at the blushing brunette. It seemed to him that she had lost the gift of speech and was unable to object to anything. And the former duchess, now looking coldly and sternly at the girl, said that she should create her own family, which would truly suit her. Melly felt her hands tremble as she pressed down on the cutlery with all her might. having long suspected that this relationship was an illusion. And now, remembering moments from childhood, when Ada once asked her to call herself Mom, Melly finally realized that she was simply lying. After all, if the lady really considered her daughter, she would have at least once invited her to a social event and not hidden her in the shadows. Or she hired a teacher for the brunette who would teach the girl etiquette, instead of accusing her of bad behavior at the table every time. But Edric, putting his hand on her trembling brown-haired hand, was already saying that all this had gone too far and was becoming a real injustice. Looking reproachfully at his mother, he reminded her that they were the only ones left with Melly, and if the woman did not want to take care of her, the Duke would not abandon the girl, despite the lack of blood ties. But Ada was outraged. She screamed and asked the young man to be quiet. After all, he was clearly crossing a line that should not be crossed. However, the Duke, already smiling, declared that if Melly decided not to marry, then he would accept this decision and would respect it. But his mother did not calm down, considering it absurd to keep the girl in one family after his wedding. Having asked his mother not to put pressure on him, he said that he was not going to change his position. Grabbing the girl by the hand, the Duke forcibly pulled her out from behind the table, demanding that she go with him and not listen to all this. And the woman was shaking with anger and disappointment, clenching her fists so tightly that her fingers turned white. Already on the move, he explained to Melly that he had told his mother not to look for suitors for her anymore. However, encouraging her, he reminded her that Rosalina was waiting for them to start living together. But the girl didn't like all this. Stopping, she asked Edric not to talk about it anymore. But he didn't calm down, saying that they would go to the cinema together. He held Melly's hand tightly, and the fleeting thought of how wonderful it would be to live with his family unexpectedly warmed his heart and soul. And now the brunette imagined how she could help them. And when they had children, she would become their nanny and do housework, remaining a part of their lives. And the scariest thing was the thought of whether she would be able to look at their happiness without pain. And if she didn't like such a role, wouldn't the brunette feel like an extra? However, what scared her most was the question of the girl being jealous of Rosalind. And that is why she understood that she needed to break this attachment as soon as possible. But he was still pulling her along. And Melly was already quietly saying that it would look strange in the eyes of others and asking to remain in her previous status. Edric couldn't even imagine that the girl would say that. And looking at the brunette with surprise, he didn't agree that she wasn't his family. But suddenly, looking him intently in the eyes, she tremblingly asked him to make her Melly Felton. At that moment, she herself did not believe that she had said it out loud, and the girl already saw horror in his gaze. After all, the Duke was clearly thinking about something completely different, but the girl immediately explained that she was only asking to officially recognize her as his sister. After all, only then will they become a real family, and the girl will be able to stay by his side, not paying attention to other people's views and gossip. Melly understood that she had made this decision under the influence of emotions. After all, such statements were not at all typical for her, but she saw no other way out. If Edric really considered her part of his family, the brunette thought, then he couldn't refuse her, she thought with hope when she made her request. However, now looking down, the young man clearly regretted the words spoken in the hall. After all, everything was taking an undesirable turn. His face hardened, and the Duke had already told Melly not to be stupid. His world had turned upside down. He had never thought that she could still be so brave, and the girl already clearly realized that she had hurt his pride. She knew how cynical Edric could be, and now this would be a rather unpleasant conversation. The young man frowned and asked her if she really thought she could just join the ducal family. He wasn't joking when he called Melly naive. Touching her trembling hand, the man demanded that she forget about this conversation. After all, Rosalina was due to arrive soon and he needed to meet her. Without turning around, the Duke quickly walked away. And Melly, clenching her fists, already perfectly realized that she should not expect any understanding from him. Bitter tears flowed down the beauty's cheeks. It seemed that the emotional pain flooded everything inside, because they dripped from her chin and flowed onto her dress. However, while wiping them, she tried to calm herself down, because she understood that she should no longer hope for anything. Melly closed her eyes and thought sadly about how insignificant and powerless she was in this house, and in the eyes of the real Feltons. At the same time, another girl, Rosalina, who had arrived at the estate ahead of schedule, was already in a great mood and was eagerly telling everyone around her about it. Her constant companion Francis, putting his hand to his chest and smiling, had already greeted the Duke of Felton with a polite bow. Edric thought it was shameless to drag a lover along to every meeting. However, he did not speak about it openly, limiting himself to polite questions about how things were going. However, Rosalind, looking around the estate, reminded that Francis always liked to be here, and now he was her guest again, and would always be welcome. The young man thanked for the hospitality, but already asked permission to take a short walk around the estate, while the Duke talked to Rosaline. And Edric, crossing his arms over his chest, nodded approvingly, but his expression spoke of displeasure. While Rosalina gently waved her hand to her companion, walking along the wide corridor and looking at the golden stucco decorating the mansion, Francis envied the Countess, who would move here after the wedding. But the next moment, he blushed slightly. His gaze was drawn to the one who was trying to see something in the window, and Melly, standing in the stream of sunlight and feeling growing uneasy, watched the couple who were chatting pleasantly in the garden. Francis already remembered that he had seen this brunette before, and now he recognized her as the girl who had once been sheltered in this house. He quickened his pace as he approached her. Straining his memory, the young man tried to remember her name, afraid of appearing impolite. And having slightly frightened Melly, he already called her by name, which seemed to emerge from forgotten memories. She quickly turned around, and from surprise did not immediately figure out what to say, but she recognized who was standing in front of her. It was the same man she had seen in Rosalina's arms around the corner, when they thought no one had noticed them. Since then, Melly learned a little about him. After all, he was not a simple guest, but the heir of Adele's house, and, at the same time, Rosaline's lover. However, now looking at her with slight anxiety, he was already asking why the girl was crying. And the young man's excitement seemed sincere. Realizing that he had hurt the brunette's feelings, he gently asked for forgiveness and offered her a handkerchief that he had taken out of his inside pocket. Melly thanked him, and he was already in a hurry to say that the girl did not have to return it. However, she felt awkward, keeping the man's personal thing with her. Looking at the girl, Francis could not understand why Duke Felton looked tense every time her name was mentioned. After all, at first glance, there was nothing special about her. However, while she was silently wiping away her tears, he thought that behind the apparent fragility, there was some kind of strength hidden. And this feeling became painful, as if he was trying to solve a riddle, but wanted to do it slowly. Looking at the girl more closely, Francis noted her petite build, pale skin, and surprisingly fragile and beautiful hands. There really seemed to be something special about her, because watching her cry, Francis found himself thinking that it awakened a strange desire in him. But was this enough to interest the Duke? He asked himself, trying to understand more deeply what could attract Edric to the brunette. He felt that the girl was not eager to communicate, and he did not insist. Having said that he hoped to see her soon, he politely said goodbye. However, the young man did not lose hope that he would be able to lift her spirits the next time they met. After all, he understood that he would visit this beautiful house more than once. Meanwhile, Edric and his guest were already drinking tea in the blue drawing room and chatting happily, and it seemed that the recent conversation with Melly had not left the Duke's memory. Holding a cup in her hands, Rosalina hurried to ask the Duke if he would be free this coming weekend. After all, the Countess had heard that the opera was expecting a premiere. But unfortunately, he was busy, Edric replied, declining the invitation and explaining that his business did not leave him time for cultural entertainment. However, it seemed that Edric was no longer listening to her. After all, with his head down, he caught himself thinking that Melly was still sitting in the room and thinking about her behavior. Returning again to the conversation with the brunette, he had already forgotten that the girl was once capable of such pressure. After all, recently she had been gentle and meek, but the Duke could not understand why she demanded her recognition in the family. And now Edric guessed that he did not know her well, and the unexpected statement seemed logical. However, the guy could not understand why he rejected her offer so harshly, as if there was something repulsive about it. Looking into his cup of tea, the young man reflected on the fact that the thought of Melly becoming his sister caused a strange internal resistance in him. Thinking about how dear the girl was to him, he returned for a walk among the sunflowers, where he admired her beautiful face in the sunset light. Even when she grew up, and his attitude towards her changed, well, as did the feeling of novelty, the warmth and tenderness towards the girl remained the same. He realized that these feelings could not be compared with his attitude towards others. After all, looking at her, he felt something close and very personal, almost native. But now it was Melly who wanted to change everything. Breaking out of her situation, she declared her desires and pushed the young man away from her. Feeling his thoughts tearing his head apart, he realized that nothing the girl asked for contradicted his desires. After all, no fundamental changes could have happened. It would just be one more line added to Edric Felton's family tree, but they would never stand on equal terms. But the very next moment, distracted from the brunette, he watched Rosalina, realizing with surprise that she was completely unsuitable for him. Judging by her tone of voice and irritated cries, the girl felt that he was deeply immersed in his thoughts and was already trying to bring him back from there. The Countess complained that she was bored with him. She also wondered why he thought so much when his future wife wanted a man to entertain her, but Edric couldn't get rid of his thoughts, and after apologizing, he continued to think about Melly, unable to return to reality. However, at some point, he already tried to get rid of the guest, referring to the fact that he was not feeling well, and already politely asked Rosalina to leave a little earlier. And a few minutes later, he was already holding a handkerchief in his hands and was clearly angry, noticing someone else's initials on it, which he definitely did not expect to see in the girl's hands. He needed to talk to Melly, but he already knew that someone else had been in the room. And the brunette hurried to explain that Lord Francis had lent it to her when she was crying. Without holding back his sarcasm, Edric was already asking if she was going to become his mistress. After all, the girl had left the room, although the Duke had asked her to wait for him there. Melly, however, was not thinking of anything like that. She tried to justify herself, repeating haltingly that she had simply burst into tears and Francis had given her a handkerchief. But Edric, grabbing the brunette by the shoulders and looking intently into her eyes, coldly insisted that the young man was just a puppet in the Count's house and was completely unsuitable for her. Moreover, the Duke reminded her with irritation that he was Rosalind's lover and was unlikely to be interested in anyone else. There was pain in his voice, and the girl immediately heard it. She tried to say something, but lost her thoughts and words. However, Edric, getting ahead of her, already declared that he would make her Melly Felton, as the girl asked, and this time he would not back down from his words, and the brunette did not believe what she heard. But the young man, already justifying himself, explained that he was scared and rushed to refuse. Therefore, he hurt the girl. Looking into her eyes, he asked her to promise that the beauty would never change, and that she would always belong only to him and remain faithful to this relationship. And Melly, at that moment, did not quite understand what exactly the Duke wanted from her. The brunette tried to ask a question, but having restrained herself, she already felt how he pressed her to himself. Hugging the man in return, she quietly promised that he didn't have to worry, because the girl would always remain the same as she was now and would always be there. Her gratitude was sincere, as the brunette perceived what was happening as a manifestation of care, not realizing the depth of Edric's internal conflict. But the Duke was already pursing his lips. After all, hatred was beginning to flare up inside him for Francis Adele, and for everyone who even briefly glanced at Melly. Clutching the handkerchief in one hand and holding the brunette in the other, he mentally swore to take revenge on the insignificant bastard who dared to be near her. Meanwhile, the luxurious white carriage that was slowly taking the guests home was already hearing reproaches against the Duke. After all, Edric had once again refused the Marchioness a ride. She needed to let out the pent-up frustration, and now, crossing her arms over her chest, the girl was angry, remembering how he had politely asked her to leave early. And Francis was already gently calming the storm. Extending his hand to her, he said that she should forget about this misunderstanding. After all, he was next to her. But now these words only irritated the girl. Having slapped her hand, the Countess already asked to leave her alone. After all, she did not want to listen to such consolations, and Francis only looked at her sadly, realizing that at such moments it was better to remain silent, because in her anger the Marquise did not hear a single reasonable word, and the boy's memory was already taking him back to the past. In it, Marquise Adele once told him that of all the possible men in their family, he chose him to be the heir to the family. The handsome but sad brunette already understood then that he could get everything he wanted and would do whatever he wanted, but he would never truly become a part of this family. After all, the Marquise's daughter Rosalina, despite her intelligence and beauty, could not inherit the family line. According to the laws of their house and time, women could not head the family line. After careful consideration, the family decided to use a distant relative as a puppet, in order to then pass the title and on to Rosalind's child, born from the marriage. Francis understood perfectly well that as soon as his role was played, he would be disposed of, and the young man already imagined the lonely life that was prepared for him. But he needed a family, not the people who sold him, but close and loving ones. And Rosalina became the person to whom the teenager gave his love. The girl appreciated his beauty, and often complimenting the guy, she hugged him by the shoulders, saying that he was her prince. This became a real salvation for the young man. They quickly fell in love with each other, and Francis believed that their feelings would outlive all statuses and restrictions, allowing him to build a family next to her. But one day, Rosalina confidently declared that she would marry Duke Edric Felton. After all, this was her parents' plan, and it was the best decision for everyone. And now he understood that there was nothing left of the former girl. In front of him sat an aristocrat for whom feelings had become a weakness, not a value. Emptiness filled him from within. However, he unexpectedly found a kindred spirit in Melly. She looked fragile, and the Duke's behavior clearly indicated that he was playing with her emotions and manipulating her. But Rosalina again demanded attention, and the guy once again calmed her down. He assured her that the Duke already felt guilty because he rejected her invitation. Smiling, Francis promised that they would definitely return to the mansion next week, and it seemed that the girl believed him. But judging by the Marquise's face, the resentment did not leave her. However, the guy had his own plans. After all, he dreamed of meeting Melly again, who had strangely touched his heart. Meanwhile, the carriage was already taking them away from the Feltons' house. A week later, they returned to the mansion again. Entering the hall of the house, they looked happy and contented, and they were already in a hurry to greet its owner. However, he was completely in no mood. Meeting them at the entrance, the Duke crossed his arms over his chest, but the expression on his face clearly showed that he was not happy about their arrival. Rosalina was chattering happily. She didn't know if the owner of the house would be there, because she had forgotten to warn him in advance. And the Duke was already gloomily wondering why they had come. By sending him a kiss, the Marquise playfully said that she did not need a reason to visit him. After all, she simply wanted to have a cup of tea with her future husband. With an imperturbable face, Edric replied that, to his shame, the tea leaves in the house had run out. But if plain water would do, the Duke would not mind the guests coming in. Looking at the strange couple, the brunette saw how Rosalina smiled reservedly, and Edric tried to show at least a little hospitality. But it tired him, and he left them. Walking around the mansion, the young man was looking for Melly. After all, only the brunette was now exciting him, and her face was before his eyes. Everything else seemed unimportant. Having opened the massive, carved door, he was already entering a spacious living room with a porcelain chandelier and crystal pendants on the ceiling which shimmered softly. Looking around, he realized that the room was empty. However, something told Francis that the girl had been here recently. But suddenly his gaze fell on the book lying on the table. However, it turned out to be a beautiful, checkered, sky-blue notebook with monograms and a thin clasp. And it seemed that it contained something more than just notes. Having opened the first page, the young man was already reading it. He almost immediately realized that this was a personal diary, each line of which was written on behalf of Melly. And the girl entering the room, realizing that he had gotten into her innermost thoughts, was already screaming with anger. After all, no one had ever touched her things without permission. She didn't understand how he was here, much less why he was holding what was her personal confession in his hands. However, the young man only smiled and tried to play with her. Melly's voice broke as she asked who had allowed him to take other people's things. But Francis wanted to know if she had received permission from the Duke to fall in love with him. The girl froze. She already understood everything. And the next moment, the guy pointed his finger at the lines in the diary where her confessions and feelings were described. Laughing, he said that there was no point in pretending to be innocent. After all, Her long messages into the air clearly indicated that she was obsessed with Edric. Waving the diary, Frances did not understand at all what women saw in the Duke, and most importantly, why Melly never confessed her feelings for this strange man. And she only quietly said that there was no point in it. Everything had been decided long ago. She had never even dreamed of the Duke marrying her, no matter how strong her love was. But Frances had already said that the brunette's naive hopes were foolish. After all, if she had decided to act, she might have awakened the Duke's interest. And the girl, clutching the hem of her dress in her fist, was trembling. She did not believe that even if the young man accepted her feelings, it could change her position in the Felton house. Still holding Frances's diary in his hands, he admitted that he would not like to find himself in the same situation. And even for the sake of the game, he did not want to put himself in the brunette's place. Having pulled herself together, Melly was already speaking harshly about how she was not his lover. She also advised the guy to leave Rosalina if he really loved her. But Frances, smiling sadly, understood what the girl was talking about. Looking at the brunette, he saw that she was stronger than she seemed, and her directness wounded him right in the heart. Coming closer, the young man could no longer restrain himself. He wanted to teach Melly a lesson and prove to her that she knew nothing about the feelings she poured out on paper. Touching the girl's chin, he was already sliding his fingers over her lips. The guy hoped that the kiss would make her feel what it was like to be desired. He was sure that if she experienced the full range of emotions from the kiss, she would never again be the modest and quiet Melly, writing down her love confessions. The brunette froze in place. She didn't know what to do or how to react, because the young man was persistent and close, too close. But at that very moment, the door swung open and Edric walked in. He froze when he saw the scene, but he had not yet seen the girl's face. His whole being shrank. After all, the man the Duke considered a scumbag had already touched what had long belonged only to him. And Felton was ready to punish him for it. Turning around, they already saw that Edric was looking at them. And the guy, smiling tensely, as if trying to distract attention from the awkward scene, was already asking why he wasn't with Rosalina. However, Edric no longer heard him. He just rushed at the young man, not waiting for words or explanations, and not even giving himself a chance to think. And the very next second, the Duke furiously struck Rosaline's lover in the face with his fist. And Melly, frightened, was already screaming and begging to stop the fight. But it seemed that the Duke was ready to kill the guest. But stopping abruptly, he turned to the girl and, choking with rage, asked why he had to stop if Frances dared to touch her. And the young man, already holding his reddened face and breathing heavily, looked at the Duke with fear. But Edric waited for an explanation, wanting to hear if he understood everything correctly. And the brunette, with a shaking voice, said that the young man had done nothing wrong. But it seemed as if her words were dissolving in the air. But Edric was already abruptly interrupting the girl, drawing attention to the fact that he was asking Frances, not her. However, Melly, not retreating, was trying to take responsibility for herself. She explained that they met by chance in the corridor, exchanged a few words, and were about to part ways without planning anything else. The beauty understood that she had to stop the conflict from developing, because if Frances mentioned her diary, everything would be much worse. She needed to get rid of the guy immediately. It seemed as if the Duke was replaying the situation over and over again. He was seething inside, realizing that he could have made a mistake, but perhaps he had done the right thing. Extending his hand to Rosalind's lover, he already spoke in a reserved manner about how he simply thought that Melly had been attacked by a stranger and could not help but intervene. And Frances calmly replied that he was fine, and that anyone could have made a mistake in a similar situation. Trying to show concern, the Duke noted that the young man had a cut on his lip, and he was already handing him the same handkerchief that the boy had once given to Melly. And he, falling on the boot of Rosalind's lover, seemed to emphasize the fact that the owner of the mansion saw and knew everything. And only the Duke could set the rules here. Edric blushed and noted reservedly that deep down he had hoped that Frances would still have a scar as a reminder. And he pulled himself together and looked at the Duke with a smile, realizing that for people like him, feelings do not exist. It seemed that by leaving, he was giving up his position. However, he had already decided to himself that this conversation was not over and the young man would definitely return. As he passed Melly, the guy whispered that they would definitely talk again. His voice sounded both gentle and reassuring. Turning in the doorway, he pretended to apologize for the inconvenience caused, as if he wanted to put a period, although in fact he was putting a comma. And the brunette, who stood opposite the Duke, was already asking what brought him into her room. She lowered her eyes and thought that Edric would be disappointed in her. He would consider the girl shameless because she invited another woman's lover into the room. The girl saw that Edric was nervous because he did not fully believe her words. And now the man was asking what they were talking about. But Melly said with confidence that they were talking about him, and only him. After all, despite the difficult relationship of late, only Edric was the one she thought about. But the young man, perceiving her words with surprise, deep down inside already regretted that he had hit Francis so hard. To diffuse the situation, he even tried to joke, and hoping for sincerity, asking what she had said about him to Rosalina's lover. And Melly, looking at one point, answered without hesitation that she was trying to convince Lord Francis not to interfere in the upcoming marriage. She also asked him to let Rosalina go, allowing the young people to get used to each other and possibly fall in love. Edric couldn't believe his ears. He hadn't expected the brunette to defend his position like that. But she continued, saying that marriage should be built on trust. Melly placed her hand on her chest and sincerely stated that she really just wanted Edric to be happy. But he, turning away his gaze, quietly said that he was entering into marriage only for the benefit of both families, and all other feelings did not matter. However, the girl, who still believed in love, only sighed heavily and continued to look at him, as if she hoped that he would change his mind. But after a short pause, Melly was already asking for forgiveness, admitting that she shouldn't have interfered. After all, she only complicated everything and also violated Edric's boundaries. But as he came closer, the young man began to peer into her eyes, trying to calm his jealousy and figure out whether the brunette was being honest. The closeness to the young man caused him a strange feeling of anxiety. However, he told Melly that the girl was not quite right, and the next second, calling Rosalind shameless, he restrainedly expressed the opinion that such a lady could not be the mistress of the Felton house. With a slight smile on his lips, he was already talking about the fact that perhaps it was worth canceling the wedding, since everything had turned out the other way. Turning around, he declared that he needed to see his guest out, and hurried to tell the surprised Melly that she would have to dine alone. And the brunette, remaining in the shadow of the light coming from the room opposite, was amazed at how often Edric was able to change his own decisions. As he walked down this corridor, the Duke considered the consequences of breaking off the wedding. He knew he had to consider other families to avoid ruining his own status. He didn't feel like a loser at all, and he was sure that it was Rosalina who was losing the opportunity to become part of his family. Edric was tired of pretending. The fight for the attention of a capricious girl was tiring the man, and her saccharine lover, deprived of honor, irritated him with his mere presence. Edric, accustomed to calculating everything in advance, was already covering his face with his hand, thinking about why this situation had touched him so acutely right now. Perhaps Melly's sincerity in defending a man she didn't love made him think. The brunette wanted to help him, removing everything unnecessary from the man's path, just so that he would be happy. And this thought made him feel somehow burdensome, but at the same time warm. It was she who had involuntarily pushed him to the idea that he did not know what he wanted. And now Edric wondered if he was capable of giving himself to a woman without having feelings for her. It seemed impossible to him that there were women like Melly, sincere and ready to sacrifice for the good of others. He felt himself gradually changing thanks to her. He did not recognize himself because all the calculations and plans of the Duke were losing their power, and emotions that were previously unknown to him filled his soul and heart. He constantly remembered Melly with sunflowers in her hands, and the Duke understood that all the threads that led him to change were drawn specifically to her. He realized that the problem was not in the situation, or even in those around him, but in himself. After all, as it turned out, he had always dreamed of a real family, and not of a place in society. And only next to the brunette did he see a home and family in which he could be himself, without playing a role and without concluding marriage contracts. Even if she just wanted to be near him, without claiming status, the Duke thought that he would like Melly to be his. He was trying to get used to what it might sound like in real life, but so far it was all quite difficult. Frozen in place, The man caught himself thinking that even if the girl considered herself useless, someone like Duke Felton could always make her useful. But the next moment, Edric realized that he was ready to go through any difficulties, just not to tie himself to Rosalina. In the end, there was another way to change Melly's status without calling her sister. When he said it out loud, he himself did not yet believe in the reality of his words, and the melody extracted from the violin instruments loudly spread throughout the area, and the musicians, masterfully wielding them, looked inspired. The dancers moved smoothly to the beat of the music, weaving the melody into their bodies. It seemed that the dance was absorbing them, flowing from one figure to another. And only Melly, who was sitting on the steps, was left out of this celebration. After all, nothing found a response in her soul and body. Thoughts and melancholy consumed the brunette. With her shoulders slumped and sighing heavily, it seemed that she was under a heavy burden of problems, not allowing music to enter her heart. But the next moment, a young man approached her and said that if the brunette continued to breathe like that, the earth would open up and swallow her. Reminding that the day was beautiful, Francis tried to cheer the girl up. However, Melly, looking angrily at the guy, was already demanding that the diary be returned to her immediately, but the brunette only said that he would think about her request. And now, gently avoiding the answer, he suggested that the girl not ruin the day and go for a walk with him. However, the brunette had already reminded him that he had suffered the last time he had tried to take advantage of Melly's weakness and lack of experience. But Francis, smiling as he extended his hand to her, said that he had destroyed the evidence. After all, the diary could have harmed her, and the man did not understand why she did not thank him. However, the girl, looking coldly at the young man, reminded him that she had not asked him to take care of her. And in general, she wanted the brunette to leave her alone. Melly rose from the steps and was about to leave, but Francis, looking slyly at the beauty, already noted that she was much more temperamental than she seemed. And now the guy asked how the girl managed to survive in someone else's house. However, she answered that she was fine, but the young man did not believe in her feigned confidence. And the very next session, without letting up, he reported that they had recently tried to sell Melly to old Lord Blair, the owner of a large company. The beauty shuddered. However, refuting the speculation and justifying Ada, she only said that the Duke's mother wanted to introduce her to a worthy man. And Francis grinned sarcastically. Not wanting to argue with her and spoil her mood, the man added that if the brunette was comfortable believing it, he would not interfere. However, he asked Melly not to deceive herself, because no one in the house considered her family. As sad as it sounded, but inside she agreed with the cynic. And then, as if by the way, he again started talking about how he and the brunette had a lot in common. But such conversations only irritated the girl. Looking at the dancing couples, Francis noted with irony that this living celebration would have suited them much better than the icy walls of a huge mansion. Trying to remain calm, the brunette hurried to remind him that he was the Adelberg heir and she was just Melly Enwood, and therefore they had nothing in common. However, the next moment, he simply shocked the girl. After all, Francis admitted that he begged the Countess to refuse the wedding. Looking at the guy, the brunette asked again. But Francis had already repeated that he could not allow the Duke to marry a woman who had a lover. But a second later, he said that it would still be hard for the girl, because she would lose her beloved man regardless of who he married. However, the young man had already complained about the Marquise because she had not listened to him. Moreover, she had even declared that she would rather break up with him than refuse to marry the Duke. Francis admitted that although the girl did not believe him, he had real feelings for Rosalina. After all, everything that she gave the guy in this life was the first time for him. The first love, the first embroidered handkerchief, and the first date will always remain in his memory, the man said tenderly. After all, they, like Melly and Edric, had been friends since childhood. The teenager adored the cheerful, slightly daring, but very sincere girl. And now he didn't want to believe that this sincerity and love had disappeared forever. But deep down, he knew that for Rosalind, he had always been just a teaching aid, a first experience that had to disappear from her life. The man resigned himself to the thought that sooner or later the Marquise would have to leave him. After all, any girl from a decent family would have done the same. Looking sideways at the brunette, he understood that he should not openly talk about his thoughts. After all, the image of an abandoned person was more advantageous in Melly's eyes, but on the girl's face, genuine emotions were already visible, and even a single tear rolling down her cheek confirmed that she was shaken by the young man's story. Francis continued his game and looked deliberately pathetic. And so the girl, not knowing the whole truth, assumed that he was really in a lot of pain. Melly didn't realize now how inexperienced she was in such intrigues. After all, she naively believed that breaking off the engagement could be a blessing for the young man. Despite all this, the brunette stood her ground and repeated again that she had not changed her opinion about how different they were. But he did not understand what the difference was. However, Melly was already quickly explaining to Francis that he had experienced love with the woman he liked, while she had been unable to give anything to the man she loved. In this way, the brunette admitted that she saw in him a much more worthy person than she had previously thought, and this aroused admiration in the girl. Having guessed his intentions, she calmly advised him to direct his ardor and passion to someone else who would truly be able to reciprocate his feelings and appreciate it. And Francis, confused and looking the beauty in the eyes, asked whether Lady Melly really considered him a decent man. However, the brunette, frowning, had already stated that she would confirm this only if the young man fulfilled his promise and returned her diary. But he, already enjoying his own intelligence, smiled. He liked to feel like a winner and watch how those around him fell into his cleverly placed nets. Over the years, Francis had become a skilled manipulator, able to evoke any emotion in people. And in Melly, he thought he had found a kindred spirit. This thought made him laugh unexpectedly. He didn't even immediately understand why he suddenly felt so happy. However, the girl only looked at him in surprise, and Francis was no longer hiding the fact that if they had ended up together, they would have made a very unusual couple. After all, everything that was happening reminded him of a gripping play. Not understanding how to act after such words, Melly smiled absent-mindedly, and the guy was already thinking that it was with her that he could be happy. However, like a true artist who had created an ideal image, the man admitted that they knew nothing about each other, but a clear plan was already forming in his head. Kissing the girl's hand, he, with a slight bow, suggested that they leave formalities and just get to know each other better. However, Melly only sighed heavily. After all, she understood what this sudden closeness could lead to, but she had already asked in what format he wanted to maintain the relationship. Perhaps the guy wanted to continue communication in an official manner, the girl asked. With a slight grin, Francis said that he would call her simply Melly. And now the man was offering to relax a little, promising to bring something tasty. He quickly left the confused Melly, who barely had time to follow the events, not realizing that she was becoming part of a carefully constructed performance. Walking quickly to get food, the man thought that the girl was too thin, and if she gained a little weight, she might become even more beautiful. Dancing as he went, he planned to make sure Melly ate well. He also hoped that the brunette would smile when she ate something tasty. However, when she was left alone, she only sighed heavily. After all, the girl did not understand why Lord Francis was behaving with her as if some kind of relationship was possible between them. Reflecting, she admitted to herself that she had never understood aristocrats, their motives and subtle games, although she herself was, to some extent, involved in their world. Melly raised her head to the sky and watched the frolicking birds. The girl wondered if this living place suited her better than the cold halls of the mansion. And the next moment, turning her gaze to the dancing people and already penetrating the music, she felt how something warm and real began to awaken inside. The dancing in the streets, the laughter of children, and the simple conversations of people seemed to give the space a different energy. And Melly's mood gradually improved, but the next moment she heard someone calling her name. Turning around, she hurried to ask why the young man had returned so quickly, but it was not Francis. It was Duke Felton who stood before her. And now, looking closely into her face, he asked what Melly was doing in this strange place. It was obvious that Melly was completely confused. However, the next moment, she quietly said that she had just gone out to get some fresh air. Cautiously wondering how the Duke had ended up in this place, she had no idea that he had been following her. But Edric said that he came to see how the reconstruction of the square was progressing, and the brunette was interested in how much he liked this place or its atmosphere. However, the Duke made it clear with just one glance that he considered the square a dirty, unkempt, and unworthy place. And Melly, lowering her eyes, but returning to her own feelings, understood that she did not agree with him. After all, it did not seem so bad to the girl. But suddenly her gaze changed. The girl was clearly frightened. After all, turning her head, she already saw Francis. It was impossible, but the brunette couldn't allow the men to collide right now. However, it looked like the Lord hadn't seen Edric yet. Panicking, trying to find a way out, she didn't know what to do. And the young man with a smile and ice cream in his hands confidently headed straight towards them. But Edric had already seen the worry and pallor on Melly's face. Trying to turn around, he asked in surprise what the brunette was seeing behind his back. But she, grabbing the Duke by the sleeve and trying to distract him, asked the young man to take her away from this place, citing fatigue. However, the blonde, already suspecting something, looked at her carefully, not understanding why the girl was in such a hurry and what exactly she was afraid of. But looking at her smile, which he had hardly seen lately, he no longer wanted to ask questions. The Duke was glad to spend time with the girl. He had been looking for an opportunity to meet for a long time and was grateful that this day allowed them to be together. And Francis, looking at the departing couple, already understood that his plans were collapsing. After all, everything he had thought up and hoped for had become useless in an instant. The young man blushed and was angry. After all, Edric was once again destroying what the Lord wanted to build, and the ice cream, treacherously spreading over his hands, reminded him of unfulfilled dreams. He sighed heavily and looked at the sun. It suddenly seemed to him that it was simply blinding and intensifying the irritation that was building up in the guy. And the very next second, throwing the ice cream onto the cobblestones, he muttered that this kind of weather was driving him crazy. But Melly no longer saw this. After all, dissolving in the instrumental music, she enjoyed the gentle melody. After all, the violinist performed it masterfully. Taking up his part, the quartet was already filling the hall with a celebration of music, and the singer, permeating the space with the words of the song, gave the event a festive mood. It seemed as if the girl sitting at the table had completely dissolved into the world of notes and sounds. Melly didn't know how to behave. Covering her mouth with her hand, the brunette quietly asked what kind of place it was. And the Duke had already informed her that it was one of the hotels belonging to the Felton House. And Melly didn't even think about the fact that they had such establishments. But the next minute, the blonde was already advising her to enjoy a steak and a Greek salad. But as soon as she picked up the table knife, Edric hurried to stop her. Noting that the girl was holding it incorrectly, he gently pointed out the mistake. Carefully touching the beauty's fingers, he showed her how to use it correctly. The man's voice was extremely calm. And then, without letting go of her hand, the Duke spoke softly about the fact that the girl should watch her manners. And smiling, he made her promise that next time she would not make a mistake. And it seemed that Edric was proud of himself at that moment. And Melly suddenly noted to herself that the young man had never paid attention to her manners before. The brunette was worried because she felt that there was something more behind his every word. And the Duke, with a slight smile, assured her that if she didn't know something, she could always ask him. But the girl, although she tried to look calm, was upset. After all, she had to be careful not to let Felton down. As she delved into Edric's world, she realized that she was running into his rules. And now Melly didn't understand why he was showing her all this and why he hadn't done it before. And the elegant singer, putting her hand on her chest and enjoying her singing, gave her talent to the people sitting in the hall. Looking at the surrounding environment, the beauty could not understand whether she was suitable for this place. She was not a commoner, but the girl could not be called an aristocrat either. However, in this room, she felt like a stranger. Not wanting to be a puppet and realizing how far she was from the Duke, she now mentally asked her mother what to do. Melly herself didn't understand whether it was worth it for her to define her place. She didn't know how her world would change if she suddenly looked different. After all, her heart longed not for titles, but for freedom. And now, sitting at the table opposite the Duke, Melly thought about giving up her noble status, not depending on him and not asking for protection. However, interrupting the brunette's thoughts, Edric was already raising his glass, saying that their new life was beginning. And Melly, confused and thinking about the man's words, put the glass on the table and didn't even touch it, which surprised the Duke. Inhaling the aroma of the drink, he quietly asked about what was troubling the girl. Being in a beautiful state, He wanted her to share it with him, and the brunette, looking down, thought about Francis. Inside, a feeling was growing that she should not have been in this hotel and at this table at all. Edric, however, was more perceptive than she thought. He watched Melly as she looked at herself in her glass, wanting to understand the reason for her anxiety. He was tormented by the question of why the girl came to the square and who exactly she was waiting for. After all, while reconstructing the events, the young man recalled that when he approached her, the beauty exclaimed in surprise and said why he returned so quickly. Melly waved her hands and tried to explain, claiming that she wasn't hiding anything, she just didn't want him to misunderstand her. However, the man, crossing his arms, reminded her in a calm voice that she could always be honest with him, because he trusted her. Edric repeated the question again, and the brunette already understood that she had to tell the truth, and there was no point in hiding anything further. Now she didn't want to look like a deceiver in the eyes of the man she sincerely loved. Having plucked up her courage and drunk a glass of wine, the girl confessed that she had met Lord Francis in the square. Continuing her story, she said that she apologized to him because it was because of her that he was hit. But Edric was already abruptly declaring that their paths would not cross again. The Duke was afraid that Francis might use Melly because she was too close to him, and now he was telling her about it. He also asked her never to meet him again. Recalling that Melly had complained of fatigue and lack of appetite, he suggested leaving the restaurant. However, the next second, the Duke said something that made the girl shudder. After all, he was not going to return home because it was too cold outside. And now he quietly suggested staying at the hotel, since they were already here. Then why not stay at the hotel for the night? And Melly turned around slightly, blushing. Edric quickly added that the view from the top floor of the building was simply stunning. Trying to justify his offer, he said that he had long wanted to show it to the girl. Turning the elegant key in his fingers, he announced with a smile that the royal suite was one of the best in this wing of the building. And then, clutching the key tightly in his fist and looking intently into Melly's eyes, he invited the girl to spend the night with him. And the next moment, the corridor was covered with silence. Standing in front of the heavy door of the apartment, they were silent, but the invisible tension was felt even in the air. Melly didn't know what to do. As if spellbound, the girl slowly moved after Edric, squeezing her fingers and feeling her heart jumping out of her chest. The brunette lowered her eyes and thought only about the fact that she loved and trusted him. And if she refused the young man now, she could lose him forever. And he was already opening the door. The wooden doors creaked open, letting the couple into the room. She couldn't shake the thought that they would end up in the same room together. The luxurious room with stained glass windows greeted them with the familiar blue decor, so familiar and inherent to the Felton home. He was genuinely interested in how the girl would perceive all this luxury, and therefore wanted to hear her opinion, and not just see her reaction. Putting his hand on Melly's shoulder, he felt her shudder, but he hastened to ask the girl about her impressions of the place they were in. And the next moment, the brunette squeezed out a short and strained admiration, realizing that she was thinking about something completely different. However, she could already feel the man's long fingers touching her hair. It seemed to her that in a little while, she would lose consciousness from the strain. Turning around abruptly, she suddenly asked if they could leave here. After all, everything that was happening was too unexpected and hasty for the brunette, for which she was completely unprepared. Looking out the window at the moonlight, she tried to explain that people might misunderstand them if they found out that they were here together. But Edric, looking at the girl, did not understand at all what she meant, and already asked for clarification. Melly didn't know what needed to be explained, because they were not married, and they were planning to stay the night in this room. I tried to explain. She had already said that despite the fact that the young man had broken off his engagement with Lady Rosaline, he would still get married sooner or later. Edric was surprised. All the brunette's arguments were too superficial to refuse intimacy. It was as if they were speaking different languages, completely unable to hear each other, and this only increased the tension between them. But the Duke, wasting no time, was already approaching Melly. And now he reminded the girl that it was her advice that he had followed and broken off his engagement with the Marquise. Sitting on the edge of the bed, the brunette felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. And the Duke, it seemed, was no longer going to stop halfway. Pressing his legs tightly against Melly, he felt for the first time how much he desired the girl. It seemed that the man could no longer control his actions. Running his hand over the beauty's cheek, He quietly said that now it was the brunette who had to take responsibility for her own words. Looking into his eyes, Melly felt that the young man would not stop until he got his way. There was no threat in his pressure, but there was a lot of determination. Slowly laying her down on the bed, Edric hurried to ask if the girl really didn't want him. "But if she tells him to stop," the blonde added, "then the Duke will do as she wants." The Duke leaned over the brunette and waited for her consent. But she did not understand how to collect her thoughts. After all, she knew that if she refused him, the Duke would get up and leave forever. However, in that case, they would remain good friends again, the girl thought, and they would simply leave the hotel, taking with them only strange memories. And upon returning to the Felton estate, everyone will continue to live in their own world while pretending that nothing happened. And now she didn't understand whether she wanted to take this step. After all, for her it meant much more than for Felton, and there would be no turning back. The thoughts were killing Melly. They were making her think about how she should just retreat, as if nothing had happened. But her heart refused to listen to her. Edric was so close, and she loved him so much, that the next moment the brunette was already asking not to stop. However, the young man seemed to know that the beauty would not refuse him, and he was already passionately and insatiably kissing the beauty, as if he had dreamed of doing this for a long time, but did not dare. And Melly cried bitterly, salty tears involuntarily flowing down her cheeks, as if she was saying goodbye to her former life. And now the Duke could not believe that it was precisely such a woman who had conquered him, and now belonged to Felton. And the young man felt that, having lost control, he was no longer able to stop, because he desired the brunette madly. Without ceasing, the Duke kissed the girl greedily, letting go of his feelings for the first time in his life. And he liked this state, because at that moment he felt real. Something inside him whispered that a man should take her completely, take possession of her every look, touch, and breath. And now there was no longer any fear between them, only a pulsating emotion that swept away all boundaries and burned away the remnants of doubt. Pulling the tie from his neck, he understood that he was ready to throw his wealth, status, mask of external indifference, and even self-pity at her feet. But the next second, he was already determined to fill this woman with himself to the very end. But suddenly smiling, he asked the girl not to worry. After all, he decided to make that Melly Felton his wife, so that no one would look down on her anymore. He wanted no one else to look at her, no man but him. And there was something frightening and comforting about that possessiveness. Looking into the eyes of the frightened girl, in which tears still glistened, he spoke of crowning her with the most precious crown and covering her with a white veil. Leaning over her, he quietly whispered that she would become a duchess. And with childish stubbornness, he asked if she really didn't believe his words. The brunette couldn't even imagine that everything in her life could change so quickly. After all, in one moment, she found herself in the very center of love of an arrogant and unpredictable man. After all, he intended to marry the poor girl, and her mind told her that he was simply following his arrogant and perverted whims. At some point, it seemed to her that if she closed her eyes, everything would disappear, crumble like a dream, and the girl would wake up alone again. She was scared to this point of trembling. After all, everything seemed like an illusion, a game of imagination, in which she accidentally found herself in the leading role, without yet understanding why. She felt like a moth flying toward a blazing fire, knowing that even if she burned, she would at least be warmed by that light for a moment, and that was stupid. The girl did not yet know what awaited her in the mansion, and how Ada would react to such news, and whether she would be able to fit into this strange, glittering world where it is too easy to get lost. But soon no one thought about anything. Two bodies, intertwined in a rush of desires, dissolved in each other, and all prohibitions retreated before this greedy desire to be together. After a while, running his fingers through the curls, the Duke was already thinking about what had happened that night, and Melly, who had fallen asleep, was quietly snoring next to him. As he hugged the beauty, Edric thought that, since he had taken the place of the head of the Felton house, his path had always been direct and calculating, and feelings had not entered into this calculation. And now, lying in a huge bed next to the girl, the young man tried to convince himself that his goals had not changed. He still wanted to build an ideal empire. But old acquaintances spoke of him only with a grin. After all, they considered Felton to be the same boy, in round glasses and shorts, who wanted to improve what had long been considered prosperous. But Melly was completely different. Not only did she not laugh, but on the contrary, she always listened, admired, and supported. The brunette understood that he was not talking about power, but about a new nation where everyone could live with dignity, feel needed, and be happy. The young man, habitually touching the frame of his glasses, spoke of his intention to eradicate old harmful practices and introduce honest laws. And only Melly believed him, unconditionally and devotedly. Her support was very important for the teenager. At that time, Edric could not even imagine how many different ideas and bold decisions he would have to tell her over all these years. He often thought about how weak the imperial family was. After all, the emperor was just a puppet and a convenient screen for those who pulled the strings and ruled from the shadows. But the Felton house stood on a different foundation. After all, everything was built on calculation, mutual benefit, and a willingness to take risks for something greater. He believed that the aristocrats had been resting on their laurels for too long, and now it was his time not just to enter the game, but to completely rewrite it. For 10 years, the Duke dreamed of rising to the top of the empire in order to cut out everything rotten that was holding back its development. And now, looking at the sleeping Melly, he honestly admitted that the girl would not be of any use to his plans, because there was no cold strategy in her. But closing his eyes and remembering her face, he realized that he could not tear himself away from her, as if she were the only exception that the Duke was willing to allow himself. She was one of the few who continued to believe in him when everyone around him was drowning in doubts and detachment. Touching her cheek with his lips, he was already whispering that he would achieve a lot if only the brunette would be next to him and give him that same smile, like in childhood. But a few hours later, Melly was sitting on the sofa surrounded by the Felton family, and Ada was already asking with interest how the night ball had gone. Without raising her eyes, the girl quietly admitted that everything had gone wonderfully, and the Duchess was already reminding him that it was time to appear in society more often and meet worthy people. Continuing the topics of marriage, the woman spoke of Lady Galen's nephew. After all, the young man, in her opinion, should be introduced to Mally at the first opportunity. Listening to his mother, the Duke squeezed the handle of the porcelain cup in his fingers ever tighter, continuing to silently observe the conversation. But as soon as the former Duchess finished wooing the brunette, the Duke confidently declared that the girl had already made her choice. And the brunette, realizing that she was not in a position to listen to anything, for a moment turned her eyes to Edric and silently asked him not to say anything unnecessary. But it was too late. The Duchess, noticing the girl's confusion, perked up. After all, she decided that amazing news was being revealed to her, which simply had to be found out right now. Clutching the hem of her dress, she felt the disturbing thought that the Duke's character was fickle catching up with her. The girl consoled herself with the thought that at least for one night, she could feel happy without betraying anyone or violating other people's expectations. This was the case when she consciously took this step, just to live at least part of her life the way the girl dreamed of. But it was more complicated than that. It seemed that the young man had completely different plans, and she felt their weight begin to tear her chest apart. Thoughts about the previous night tormented the brunette, and she was already ashamed of those demanding manifestations of her temperament. And now that Melly's hidden side was brought to light, she realized what kind of woman she could be and what she could give to a man. However, the former Duchess, looking ahead at the young people, was already saying that this should be a lavish wedding, which meant it was time to start preparing. Looking at Ada, she quietly asked to let her go. After all, she understood that they would still do as they saw fit. The lady watched in bewilderment at the changes in the once submissive girl, and Edric, with his head down, prepared to talk to his mother. As soon as the door closed behind Mally, the Duchess was already demanding information about what house the girl's fiancé came from. But Edric calmly stated that he was the best bachelor in the empire. Ada tensed up. Looking at her son, she didn't immediately understand who he was talking about. But he added that he was talking about a man with such strength and power that even the emperor would not dare to act arrogantly before him. And the very next moment, folding his arms across his chest, the Duke said something that made the woman freeze in place. Smiling and looking straight into his mother's eyes, the son spoke about his plans to marry Mally. However, the woman could no longer restrain herself. Jumping up from her seat, she screamed, accusing her son of madness. But Edric, not reacting to the hysteria, remained calm. He continued to shock Ada by telling her that he had called off his engagement to Rosalina. After all, he knew that this news would officially reach her this morning. But the former Duchess, trembling with rage, promised that she would not allow a wedding that would give rise to bad rumors. In a fit of hysteria, she insisted that the daughter of a poor baron could not become a duchess. After all, society would not understand Edric's choice. But the young man, looking at his mother, reminded him that no one would dare speak out against the Felton house, and he was not going to change his mind. And she had already threatened the young man that she would never accept Melly as her daughter-in-law. After all, such a relationship seemed to her a disgrace to the entire family. However, Edric, who had lost his former gentleness and did not hide his irritation, made it clear that she would not have to take anyone's side at all. Throwing the keys on the table and looking into his mother's eyes, he confronted her with the fact that he and Melly had spent the night together, and he did it completely consciously. And the lady, blushing and turning pale at the same time, could not believe that her smart, cautious, and calculating son could allow something like this. Clenching her fists and trying to contain her anger, although everything was boiling inside, she condemned the act, which was incompatible with her expectations. After all, her son was like an exquisite and tempting fruit that all the ladies in society were striving for. But he always kept his distance, despite the hunt for him. Possessing a noble appearance, a sharp mind, and the status of the head of the house, he could choose the most refined bride worthy of the ducal title. After all the girls were looking for his gaze, hoping for attention. However, Edric, each time raising the bar higher, moved away from them. Now the Duchess blamed herself for not having noticed in time how the fragile girl, who was always hanging around him, would one day end up in the Duke's bed. The lady couldn't understand how he could choose the silent and reserved Melly. But at the same time, deep down, she knew the answer to this question. And the brunette, walking along the long corridor, thought that there was little time left before the wedding, and now she was trying to find the strength to finally part with Edric. And indeed, very soon, the letter about breaking off the engagement was no longer in the hands of the Duke's mother, but of the Marquise, who did not expect such an outcome. She read the lines over and over again, refusing to believe what was happening. The beautiful and independent blonde was confident in herself and her future with Edric. However, her lover, without further ado, reported that the Duke of Felton had made his final decision, and in a rage, she screamed about whether the Duke had really chosen Malie Enwood. Her scream tore through the silence of the room. After all, abandoning the Marquise of Adelberg's daughter for a gray mouse who had never stood out and had no worthy origins was absurd. But the brunette calmly stated the fact that marriage with a poor girl would not benefit the Felton house, and soon they would be disgraced because of the Duke's stupid decision. In response to this, the girl furiously threw the ill-fated letter at him. The beauty sobbed, not understanding how she would now look for another groom if she had been abandoned. Rosalina lowered her head and fought back tears. After all, a few days ago, she was sure that she would become a duchess, and now her dreams were shattered by Melly, who did not know her place. And the young man, finishing his tea, thought for a minute, also thinking about his place in this house. Remembering the brunette, he noted her calm restraint and ability to remain silent. And now he understood that this place for her was as if predetermined by fate. Observing everything from the outside, he began to understand that perhaps he simply did not know his place and was always making mistakes in people. However, the next moment, Rosalina was already laughing, and the words that she was going to marry Francis, which she addressed to her father, shocked the young man. Turning around, she already put her finger to her lips, and with a thoughtful face began to go over in her mind the surnames that would suit her luxurious name. But a minute later, as if having pulled a successful idea from his memory, the Lord suggested the girl the surname Herbert, causing her genuine surprise. The beauty perked up and quickly asked again which house it belonged to, and also why Francis had suggested that one. However, the man, smiling, said that he was joking, although deep down he understood that sooner or later they would definitely return to this conversation. And the Felton house was already filled with rumors about a broken engagement with Rosalind, although no one could confirm with certainty the veracity of these speculations. The maids whispered among themselves and spread rumors that the Duke had decided to send the former Duchess to the southern estate. And one of them, lowering her voice, was already telling the others that she had accidentally overheard Ada complaining about her son, calling him ungrateful. And Melly, covered with a blanket, hid in her own bed, not wanting to see anyone and unable to understand how everything could have turned out like this. Even in her sleep, she heard gossip where those around her assumed that the brunette had seduced the Duke of Felton, despite the fact that he was engaged. They did not stop talking day or night, and everyone around, as if by agreement, repeated the same thing. After all, they believed that the girl had forgotten her place, and it was high time to remind her of it. But Melly had done nothing of the sort, the beauty thought. Her heart knew no treachery. However, no one seemed to want to believe it. The girl thought she heard her mother's voice. The woman was irritated and worried. She scolded her daughter for not refusing Edric that night, because she was sure that Melly could find the strength not to believe the Duke's words. She complained that the beauty had forgotten her instructions, believing that the man she loved would eventually force her to marry another and break her heart. Advising her to urgently take the diary from the man who knew about her dirty feelings for the Duke, she urged the girl to act. The woman convinced her daughter that most likely that man would give the diary to Edric, and the Duke would learn about the girl's painful love for him. The next second, Melly woke up, gasping for air with anxiety. She didn't fully realize where she was, but her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. Clutching the blanket with trembling fingers, she feverishly thought about what to do. Thoughts piled up one on top of the other, and the next minute she jumped out of bed. The brunette understood that the diary had to be returned at any cost. And now nothing could stop her, not even the darkness outside the window. The Duke loved this majestic mansion. Admiring the stars in the evenings, he understood that his mansion was not inferior in beauty to the starry sky. Inhaling the evening scents, Edric already saw how the girl who had just recently been next to him quickly ran out of his house. It was obvious that she was in a hurry, but Melly didn't know that she was under the close attention of her future husband. And the Duke was curious where she was heading at such a late hour. From her hurried steps, it was obvious that the brunette was worried about something and did not want to be noticed. But now he remembered that she had been upset since the morning. Moreover, it seemed to the Duke that her thoughts had wandered somewhere very far away. However, Edric had to calm his mother, who was becoming more and more irritated with each passing hour, and so he could not pay the necessary attention to Melly. Leaning on the balcony balustrade, the young man was already thinking about how he should propose to her for real. After all, the events of the previous night had been too spontaneous, and Francis was already quickly leaving another mansion. After his recent conversation with Rosalind, he needed air. Clicking his lighter, the guy thought about how pointless it had become to indulge the whims of the Marquise every day. But suddenly his gaze stopped on the girl, pressed against the wall. Holding the cigarette in his mouth, he was clearly surprised. After all, she, judging by her trembling shoulders, was quietly crying. Her name came out of the man's mouth, and there was confusion and uncertainty in his voice. He had not expected to see the girl here, and in such a state. And Melly was already raising her tear-stained and red from tears. Leo. A shadow of relief flashed in the girl's gaze, and the next moment he was already asking what she was doing in this place at such a late hour. And she quietly and almost soundlessly said that she had come for the diary. Francis felt uneasy. He admitted that he still had the diary, but he sincerely could not believe that the tears in her late visit were caused only by this. Trying to figure out what happened, the guy suggested Melly go inside. But that was out of the question, and she asked again for her notes back. And now the beauty muttered that she was unable to meet Rosalina. After all, she imagined the state she was in after hearing the news about the broken engagement. His hand gently touched the girl's head. He wanted to calm her down a little, because it hurt him to look at her. But as she pulled this man's hand away, she continued to listen about how Rosalind had been abandoned practically at the altar. However, such things did happen, especially among aristocrats, Francis added. He asked her not to worry about the Marchioness. Wasn't that what Melly wanted so much? And now she had to be happy. Or did the girl no longer have feelings for the Duke? Francis asked. However, raising her eyes, she was already asking the young man whether he really believed that she could win the heart of a man like Edric. Francis's gaze lifted to the sky, reminding her of how she had once told him that he simply didn't know his place. But now Melly was apologizing for her harshness in the past. The man smiled. Noting that he had changed recently, he advised the beauty to change her views on life. But it seemed that the girl did not quite understand what he was talking about. After all, no one has the right to decide who and who to choose, she added. And he only convinced her to be honest with herself. And smiling again with his charming, almost boyish smile, the Lord asked the beauty not to forget about Frances Herbert when she became the Duchess of Felton. For a moment, Melly thought that there was a completely different person in front of her. In his smile, the brunette wanted to warm up from the gossip of the Duke's cold mansion, and after some time, he handed her the diary. And the girl, excited, accepted it, as if she were regaining part of her lost memory. She felt relief as she clutched the notebook to her chest. Her gaze no longer showed contempt, but a grateful smile and appreciation for the fact that he had kept her secret. Turning around, she quickly walked away. And Francis, looking after her, caught himself thinking that when she smiled, she became a real beauty. But Melly wasn't just walking quickly, she was already running through the darkness towards her happiness. And Francis, looking sadly at the night sky, kept thinking about the brunette. The man understood that he could not steal someone else's loving woman, and this time he would have to retreat. Closing his eyes, the young man returned to the past. After all, there, once in childhood, his life completely changed. But it did not become happy. He remembered the day he was first introduced to his new family, and the Marquis told the teenager that he was incredibly lucky, and the boy believed the grown man. His name was Francis Herbert. But now he was trying to remember who he had been before he became Adelberg, and whether the teenager had known his place then. Continuing to look at the black velvet, strewn with stars, he realized that perhaps it was time to find out where his true place really was. Melly walked quickly into the hall of the mansion. Her heart was beating anxiously because she was afraid that Edric would find out about her meeting with Francis. The brunette stopped and listened. Realizing that the house was silent, the beauty sighed with relief. At some point, she felt happy. Thoughts were rushing and giving no rest. Melly wanted to hide the diary, forgetting about it forever. But stopping, the brunette suddenly thought that perhaps burning the notebook would be more correct than trying to hide it. Smiling shyly and blushing slightly, Melly realized that with such an act, she would put an end to her quiet and unspoken love. However, memories were already catching up with the beauty. Francis's voice was again ringing in her ears, saying that no one has the right to decide where a person should be. Something inside the girl contracted, and she really wanted to be sincere with herself, especially since it was entirely possible. And before her eyes, the events of that night surfaced, when Edric confidently said and suggested that the girl make her a duchess. What if Edric also felt something for her and just couldn't tell her about it? The girl thought. Then the words in the hotel could have been sincere. Pressing the diary tightly to her chest, the brunette thought that she might be mistaken in her assumptions. However, her heart so wanted to believe in sincere and mutual love. And now Melly was hurt. After all, she had allowed herself to dream and did not know how to stop. But the Duke's actions and words gave the girl hope. After all, the beauty always wrote lines about love with his name on her lips, putting into each letter feelings that Edric did not even suspect. At these moments, Melly felt happy. Her dreams were filled with light, and the girl thought that someday they would come true. Approaching the door, the brunette was already touching the handle. Mentally deciding to confess, she realized that this could bring her pain and destroy their relationship. Opening the door slightly, she felt everything inside her tremble, because the light was on in the room. But she understood that she had to take this step, no matter what. Entering the room, the beauty froze. She had not expected to find the Duke doing such a thing, and her plans were ruined in an instant. But he, looking at the glass of wine, was already hurrying to greet Melly. But there was irritation and resentment in his voice. His name froze on the lips of the brunette. Looking at the young man with fear, the girl understood that he was completely out of mood. And the next moment, blushing and smiling stupidly, he was already asking how well the beauty had spent that night. However, Melly, clutching the diary to her chest, hurried to explain everything. After all, she had simply returned for her thing. But his gaze already showed suspicion that could not be hidden by words. Rising from the table, he quickly approached the girl. He was terribly interested in seeing what the beauty needed to take from Lord Francis. And the next moment, abruptly snatching the diary from her hands, he already heard Melly scream. She begged him to give her the diary. But the Duke asked whether the brunette had really met Francis at night just for the sake of this notebook. However, the girl's voice changed abruptly, and now she was no longer begging, she was demanding. But Edric only smirked, continuing to accuse her of betrayal. And before she could come to her senses, Melly already saw the diary flying into the fireplace with a dull sound. Without thinking, he grabbed a bottle of wine from the table, and the next moment, with a sharp movement, he poured the alcohol onto a checkered notebook. The man's spontaneous behavior was killing her. She begged him to stop, but the young man seemed deaf. After all, something stronger than reason was raging inside him, but she already saw a lighter in the Duke's hands. The born fire flew towards the notebook, trying to destroy the sheets of paper that carefully kept her feelings. Throwing herself into the fireplace after him, she did not want the memory to be destroyed. However, the fire was rapidly consuming what Melly had written for so many years. But Edric couldn't allow the girl to burn her hands and held her back with decisive movements. He demanded an explanation. The young man's voice trembled with jealousy and anger, but the brunette only demanded that he let her go. Watching her diary burn, along with her tenderly described feelings and declaration of love, Melly screamed and cried. It seemed to her that in the flames of the fire she saw the image of her mother, who advised the girl not to worry. After all, no one would ever be able to manipulate her again, and no one will ever know how much the brunette loved the Duke. How she hid this feeling behind silence, fearing that confession would destroy everything that connected the girl with him. And the next second, Melly already wished for everything to turn to ashes and disappear forever. Edric saw that something was happening to her. He was calling her name, shouting, but the girl seemed not to hear him, immersed in a heavy internal numbness. She couldn't come to her senses for a long time. The brunette cried and struggled, screamed again and asked him again to let her go and just let her disappear. Meanwhile, his mother, rocking in her chair and slowly enjoying her wine, thought about the fact that her son had gone away on business again. But after a few minutes, she was asking the servants where Melly had gone the night before. And the secretary, who was waiting for the Duke in the meeting room, did not understand what had happened to him. After all, the Duke was disheveled and did not react to him at all. However, it was necessary to work, and the young man was already in a hurry to ask about the schedule for today. But the Duke sharply demanded that everything be postponed. After all, he had no desire to meet with anyone. He turned around and left, throwing over his shoulder that he was going hunting. Without turning around and slowly leaving the room, he asked the guy to prepare a rifle for him. And the secretary, accustomed to following orders, was already rushing to get the weapon. But in another room, a devastated Melly sighed heavily, looking at the ceiling. Her imaginary world was collapsing, and her thoughts were becoming heavy as lead. Tears rolled from this girl's beautiful eyes. Looking at one point, it hurt her to think that Edric would still marry her off to someone else. The brunette felt like a butterfly on scorched earth. She didn't know whether she should talk about her feelings for the man, or whether silence would be more appropriate in such a situation. But now she remembered his angry, accusing look. She was tormented by the question of why he did not trust her and why he doubted her. The night spent together did not leave Melly's memory, and the annoying question did not give her peace. And now she asked the Duke if everything that had happened between them had been a mistake. He looked at her confused and didn't know what to answer. After all, he would never have thought that a girl could think that way. But the brunette, barely raising her eyes, quietly said that all this was a misunderstanding, which over time would simply turn into a memory. Edric was silent. He felt uneasy. The thought that Melly could play with his feelings frightened the young man. His face twisted. Edric remembered how he had offered to make her a duchess, and now he felt that she had simply ignored his offer. Leaning towards the brunette and lifting her chin, the Duke said that he did not believe that she could see him as just a man for one night. At that moment, the blonde realized that he couldn't tear himself away from her. He was so close that he could feel her breath and also strong excitement. Edric couldn't let the beauty reject him. His kiss, strong and passionate, was already trying to convey to the brunette that she was wrong. After some time, a lone shot cut through the silence of the forest, causing the birds to take off from the branches. Somewhere in the distance, the howl of a wounded beast was heard, and it seemed to Edric that the predator's body went limp in the grass. However, as he came closer, he already understood that he had not killed the beast, but only wounded it. But the predator, tucking its paw, was already hiding in the thicket of the forest, leaving behind traces of blood. The Duke thought about it, because he thought that he was not the type to apologize to Melly for his behavior. However, the beast, not forgiving the mistake, was already attacking the hunter. And soon, the ascetic hospital building with its barred windows and doors was already greeting its worried visitor. Leaning against the wooden counter, the brunette quickly looked around, hoping that one of the staff would notice her. And indeed, after a while, a lady with a folder in her hands approached Melly. Looking at the worried visitor, she clarified the reason for her visit to the hospital. Leaning on the counter, it seemed that the brunette was about to fall. It was painful to look at her, but the girl declared that she urgently needed to get to Duke Felton's ward. However, the woman had already said that she could not disclose information about patients to outsiders, and now she was trying to clarify who Melly was to the Duke. The brunette froze. She couldn't immediately find the right words that would emphasize her special status. Now she was thinking about who she was to Edric, but she couldn't find an answer because the situation remained quite confusing. She wasn't part of his family, and the Feltons would never accept the brunette, no matter how much she wanted to. And the girl couldn't bring herself to call herself a friend. After all, that would definitely be a lie, since they had crossed the line of simple friendship. Melly clenched her fist and thought about what she could say without worrying about being thrown out on the street. And the next moment, she slowly and tensely squeezed out that she was his bride. However, the woman at the reception, covering her mouth with her hand and surprised, was already beginning to mock the visitor. She didn't believe that a girl like Melly could be the Duke of Felton's bride. But the brunette couldn't accept that a random person could treat her like that. And now she looked at the stranger with reproach. However, the lady did not calm down and continued to be sarcastic. And she already said that a skinny and disheveled brunette, deprived of absolutely all jewelry, could not have such a groom. She didn't understand what in her could make those around her think that the girl was the Duke's bride. But the brunette was in a hurry and didn't pay any attention to her appearance. Swallowing her resentment, Melly did not want to explain to the horrible lady that she had chosen the simplest and most modest clothes she had, and she had never had any expensive dresses. All more or less decent items of clothing were always borrowed from the Felton house. Clenching her fists, the brunette could not even imagine that the lack of expensive dresses could turn against her at an important moment. But the woman at the reception, trying to finish off the girl, explained it that the Duke's real bride, named Rosalina, was already in the room. And Melly shouted back that it was impossible, because Edric had broken off the engagement. But the lady was surprised, because she had not seen such news in the press. With her arms folded across her chest and a fake smile on her face, she was already offering the girl to undergo an examination. Because she believed that the brunette was clearly mistaken, Melly was so worried that she felt her legs giving way. The fear that had flared up paralyzed her body, but she did not believe that Edric could deceive her. And to finally humiliate the brunette, she was already in a hurry to call security and take her out of the hospital. However, a male voice, heard from afar, asked to wait for the lady and not to jump to conclusions. And the very next moment, Francis quickly approached the counter. Calmly looking at the woman, he declared that the girl was his friend, and he took responsibility for her. And Melly, quickly turning around and surprised by his appearance, was already calling him by name. And soon she was slowly following Francis as she moved along the corridors of the hospital. She was looking for a moment to thank the young man, but he asked the brunette not to say anything. Turning his head, the Lord assured that there was no need to worry. After all, Rosalina and Duke Felton were really no longer engaged. The young man reminded them that they had come to visit the Duke only at the insistence of the Marquise. He also noted that Melly must know how stubborn aristocrats can be. It was strange to hear such words from Francis, the girl thought. After all, he himself was one of them. However, now the brunette preferred to remain silent. Approaching the door, he knocked, and without waiting for an answer, the young man already warned that he was entering. However, when they opened the door, they froze on the threshold, not expecting to see what appeared before their eyes. The silent question hung in the air. And the next moment, alarm and bewilderment flashed in their eyes at the same time. After all, Rosalina, leaning over the Duke, kissed him tenderly, trying to pretend that there was no break between them. Trying to pull the Marquise back, Francis had already called out to her. At the same time, Melly, running up to the bed, was already overcome with the desire to return what rightfully belonged to her. Sharply pushing the Marquise aside, she seemed out of her mind. The blonde almost fell over from surprise, looking at the disheveled girl in bewilderment. But the next moment, a smile appeared on Rosalina's face, and she said with mockery that Melly had finally come to the object of her love. However, the brunette, in a trembling voice, was already asking the marquise what she was doing with the patient who was unconscious. But Rosalina, trying to calm the hysterical woman, was already hitting her hard on the cheek, declaring that a commoner could not have any relation to the Duke. Melly began to cry from the hurt and pain. After all, she had to look for her status again. Her thoughts were confused. Asking herself who the Duke really was, she realized that concepts such as childhood friend, younger sister, or casual affair no longer fit. She was the one who tenderly wrote lines of love for the young man and sincerely dreamed of being near him. And now she firmly declared that she was Edric's bride. And to put a bold period and stop further conversations, she added that the Adelberg house is no longer connected with the Felton house. She demanded that Rosalind and Francis leave the room immediately and leave them alone. For the first time, the girl felt that her feelings were stronger than fear and uncertainty. And Edric, who was still lying motionless in bed, was already struggling to hold back a smile. He understood that a new and selfless Duchess of Felton was being born, and the horses, clattering with their horseshoes, carried the luxurious white carriage away from the hospital. Frances was already in a hurry to ask the marquise why she had hit Melly in the face. However, the beauty acted as if nothing had happened, and soon, calling Felton a bastard, Rosalina was already telling about how he asked to kiss him at a certain moment. And for this, the Duke promised her half of the rights to the road construction project. The brunette couldn't believe his ears. However, the blonde added that he even offered to publish an article stating that the girl had rejected him. And now Frances realized that they had come to an agreement. She was hurt after the engagement was broken, but the Marchioness could not refuse such a lucrative offer. And the Lord wanted to quickly end this nasty conversation, speaking about the fact that he understood everything, the man thought. Returning to the thought of what the true face of an aristocrat might be, he now saw it in all its glory in the face of the marquise. And Melly, sitting down by the Duke's bed and resting her head on her hands, doubted how right she had acted. Exhausted by her experiences, she soon fell asleep, but after some time she already felt a warm and gentle hand rest on her hair. Waking up, and without changing her position, she raised her eyes, in which there were tears, and looked at the Duke. At that moment, she suddenly thought that Edric was the man she had chosen, and therefore everything she had done was right. And the young man was already greeting the awakened beauty with the coming day. Sitting on the edge of the chair, the brunette hurried to ask how the young man felt. However, he asked not to worry the girl, because he was fine, and the wounds were not deep. But the Duke said that everything was fine, because the wounds were not that deep. But the girl did not believe his words and asked him to show her. And Edric, embarrassed, did not give her such an opportunity. But the girl was quite persistent and already said that she had to see all this. After all, her loving heart wanted to make sure that these were not just words. However, he, smiling and understanding how sincerely she cared about him, again said that he was really completely fine. And the next moment, looking down, the blonde painfully told about how he had made a stupid mistake during the hunt, which almost cost him his life. Unbuttoning his shirt, Edric couldn't tell the brunette that at the moment the wolf attacked him, the man was thinking about her, and Melly could already see the bandaged shoulder and chest. Blood was still seeping through the bandages, and Edric was slightly blushing from her proximity. He heard the girl sigh, and her trembling hands indicated that the beauty was so worried that her anxiety was palpable. Covering her mouth with her hands, she began to cry quietly. Speaking about the fact that this was a very serious injury, the girl was very sorry, feeling deep guilt. But the next moment, the young man quickly buttoned his shirt, saying that it was not fatal. However, Melly noticed that he needed bed rest. She felt her loving heart breaking with pity. As she continued to cry, she thought that this could have been avoided. After all, she knew that Edric was quite skilled in hunting, and that a simple wolf would not have hurt him. The girl understood that their quarrel had made the man lose his temper. And so, having lost his composure, he had gotten hurt. And now she was in a hurry to ask him for forgiveness. And the young man, stroking the girl's face, was already calming Melly. His touches and words were full of tenderness. And the next moment, pressing her head to his shoulder, Edric quietly spoke about how he missed her and how pleased he was to see the girl nearby. Without letting go of her embrace, the man reassured the brunette, saying that only small scars would remain. He was pleased by her warmth, and now the Duke was asking Melly how they had gotten to this point, since they had never argued so much. They cared for each other for so many years, and now all they did was hurt each other. Releasing the girl from his embrace, he remembered that he always felt calm next to her. After all, she always accepted him as he really was. And now, looking at the girl's face and wiping away the tears, he said that perhaps that was why he wanted her. And Melly, not knowing what to answer, only faithfully repeated his name. However, Edric, tightly squeezing the girl by the shoulders, was already testing her feelings. After all, he said that she could break off the relationship if she considered it necessary. Noticing that Melly had been crying all the time lately, the Duke felt like he was only making the situation worse. However, she did not understand what the blonde was talking about. But the man continued to claim that he could not keep her because of his own egoism. The girl was trembling and thought that he was completely wrong. However, she could not bring herself to say that she loved him very much. Jumping up from her chair and spreading her arms, the brunette was already saying that she would not cry anymore and that she was not at all sad next to him. Melly remembered everything in detail, and now she told the Duke about their first meeting, which she kept in her memory. It was snowing outside that evening. The young man didn't understand what the brunette was talking about, but she was already remembering when the teenager greeted her mother that night when they entered the snowy mansion, and what indescribable delight the girl was in when they ran carefree along the shore of the lake and did not think at all about the future, and also reminded about the holiday when she came of age and he was her only guest. Pouring wine into glasses, they had a great time. She couldn't imagine her life without him, because the Duke was in every moment of Melly's life. And now the beauty admitted that she really tried to leave the young man. But soon she realized that her place was next to him. After all, in her heart there was always only Edric. And she remembered when it began. Putting her hand to her chest, the girl confessed that she loved the Duke. And he, lightning fast, grabbed the girl in his arms and was already pressing her slender body to himself. Melly felt her breath catch. His passionate but gentle kiss seemed to envelop every cell of her heart and soul. Dissolving all worries, it filled the brunette's body with unknown bliss. Their hearts beat in unison, creating harmony, and their souls intertwined in a continuous dance of emotions, forgetting about time and the outside world. Edric knew that the moment was right to ask the brunette to marry him. Melly's tears, like diamonds, scattered on the man's hands and her dress. Of course she agreed and wanted to shout about it to the whole world. Dissolving into each other, she thought that her mother was wrong, and the girl would definitely find her happiness with Edric. After all, she had dreamed about it for so long. And now, when her beloved offered her to become a duchess, she was ready to do everything to be with him. And Edric was already hastily and tenderly laying her down on the bed. The man understood how much he wanted her, but unlike last time, he was already in control of his feelings. The man couldn't stop thinking about how well the girl hid her feelings. After all, he couldn't even imagine that Melly had been in love with him all this time. However, the Duke wanted there to always be absolute honesty between them, and asked them not to hide anything from him in the future. The man asked the beauty to relax and think only about him. After all, the young man's egoism wanted to completely absorb Melly. The atmosphere in the mansion was supported by the aromas of white roses, placed in vases. The maids congratulated the brunette, and also said that they did not suspect love between the young people. One of the girls doing her hair noted that relationships that transcended social differences were rare. And so it all seemed incredibly romantic. Turning to her friend, she was interested in whether she could marry someone from the nobility, but the girl only noted that for this one must have noble origins. They discussed it as if they weren't standing next to Melly herself, because at some point they were already guessing about who her father was. But continuing to comb the upset bride's hair, they openly noted that her appearance and way of life were not much different from those of a commoner. And now the brunette understood how it looked in the eyes of other people. She knew that the talk and gossip would be eternal, so she tried not to pay attention to it. Remembering the hospital room, she saw how the Duke stroked her hair with pleasure. It seemed that he was afraid that the girl would disappear. In the moonlight coming through the windows, he would quietly say that something was bothering him, and the next moment, he would be asking her if she could be a good duchess. Explaining that this was not an easy role, Edric spoke about the rules of etiquette and the need to interact with members of high society, as well as form the necessary connections. And the hospital walls had already heard that she would also bear the responsibilities of the mistress of this house, and the quality of the work of all the servants would depend on Melly. But the girl, listening attentively, assured him that she would do everything possible. And the next moment, she thanked the Duke again for choosing her. Having kissed the girl on the forehead, he closed his eyes. But in order not to frighten the beauty, he already said that as a husband and head of the Felton house, he would also fulfill his duties. And now, moving in a luxurious wedding dress with a bouquet of flowers in her hands, Melly understood that she could not let down this man's expectations. The brunette's memory again recalled the words of his mother, who accused the girl of seducing her son. After all, she did not believe in the sincerity of her son's feelings. As she climbed the stairs to the ceremony hall, she recalled how Ada flatly refused to leave for the southern estate, fearing to leave the Duke in her care. She rudely stated that Melly still had to prove that she was worthy of being the mistress of the house. The woman turned around demonstratively and was already leaving her future daughter-in-law to the servants. The former duchess never thought that her son's wedding would bring her so much grief. And the girls, already pushing the bride, said that it was time to go out because all the preparations were finished. Closing her eyes, the brunette did not understand whether she was ready for such a long, difficult, and contradictory path that was beginning right now. But through the open door, the sunlight was already rushing to illuminate Melly's face. At that moment, the girl involuntarily wondered what her mother would say when she saw all this. Standing on the threshold, she assumed that, like many others, the woman would judge her. And perhaps she would add that the brunette did not correspond to this status. But looking at the man standing in the hall in a long, dark coat and the registrar ready to witness the marriage, the bride understood that she was following her heart. It was noticeable that Edric was excited. He blushed slightly and watched Melly with a sincere smile, and she thought that he was a gift for her patience and love. They were clearly embarrassed, but at the same time, the young people understood that a new chapter in the history of the Felton house was now beginning. And the registrar, waving his arms, was already finishing the ceremony. Only a small but important formality remained. And the next moment, he asked the newlyweds to look at each other and exchange rings. Looking at the thin and trembling girl, Edric extended his hand. And she, trembling with excitement, put hers into it as a sign of trust and support. However, her look soon changed. After all, she did not expect to see on her finger the very ring that the Duke had once put on the finger of another woman. A beautiful ring with a large cushion-cut diamond was already on Melly's finger, but it had once been specially made for Rosalina. However, Edric, slightly leaning towards his wife's ear, had already quietly admitted that he had not had time to order a new ring, and now he was sincerely apologizing. And the girl, tightly clutching the dress in her palms, understood that the wedding had been prepared in a hurry, and the ring was not the most important thing in the story of their love, the brunette reassured herself. And interrupting Melly's thoughts, the registrar was already talking about how the young people were bound together forever, and he also invited the guests to congratulate the newlyweds. But at that moment, it was noticeable that some of those present were looking at the young family with barely concealed disdain. Moreover, the guests allowed themselves to openly turn away from the beautiful couple. But Melly promised herself not to pay attention to this. After all, this was the happiest day of her life. However, the behavior of those present made her think, was there really not a single person in the room who was sincerely happy for them? But looking back for a moment, it seemed to her that she heard the voice of a close and dear person, and soon she already saw the image of her mother, who, hugging the dissatisfied Ada, quietly asked why the woman was dissatisfied with her son's choice. Trying to support her daughter, she seemed to be trying to convey to this woman all the love she felt for Melly. But suddenly the girl's eyes darkened, and it seemed to her that she had entered another reality in which everything lost its outlines. A second later, the girl fell unconscious, and Edric, kneeling before his wife, was confusedly trying to understand if everything was okay with her. And a few minutes later, the Duke's mother was already loudly indignant in the newlyweds' room. She did not understand why she had lost consciousness at such a solemn moment and in front of all the guests. Sitting on the bed, the girl quietly apologized. However, Ada stated that she had no desire to meet with guests after such a disgrace. But the very next second, she handed Melly a marriage registration document and demanded that she read it. Anticipating the girl's reaction, the lady dryly informed her that Melissa was now officially part of the Felton household. And then she added whether the girl was attached to her old, pathetic name, as if expecting an immediate rejection of it. Melly, looking at her, tried to contain her excitement and, calling the woman mother, noticed that her name was indicated incorrectly on the document. However, Ada had already spoken harshly about changing the girl's name, since it did not stand out at all among the names of the servants. And Melly, quietly comprehending what was happening, was already repeating her new name. And now she was trying to get used to the idea that from this day on, it would become her official name. Heading towards the exit, the lady was already throwing over her shoulder that her daughter-in-law would recover as soon as possible. Etiquette lessons would begin very soon, and she had hired a tutor for the brunette. The woman did not want the family's money to be wasted, but Edric was already entering the room. He turned around and looked silently at his displeased mother. He quickly approached Melly and sat down on the bed, asking with concern how his wife was feeling. And she, sighing, was already reading the document to him. However, from Edric's expression, it was clear that he knew about it in advance. But the very next moment, the young man, trying to defuse the situation, said that he himself had chosen this name for her. But Melly was shocked by the fact that her husband hadn't even thought to consult her. And she already knew that this was unlikely to change in the near future. And Edric, trying to justify himself, already said that he wanted to keep his old name. But his uncle was against it, and the Duke did not want to bring discord into the family. The Duke knew his wife was upset. But was it because it didn't say Melly Felton that she was too upset? The Duke wondered. The girl was saying that she was okay, clutching the edge of the blanket in her fingers. After all, it was just one small part added to her name. The beauty thought. But putting his wife's tiny hand in his own, he assured her that she would quickly get used to the new name. However, the man would still call her Melly. And the next second, trying to make amends, he approached her, then hugged her and quietly whispered that he loved her. For a moment, the girl seemed to distance herself from the Duke, but she still answered that she loved him too. Realizing that everything around her was changing too quickly, she did not have time to adapt to the new. But her husband's kiss was so warm and gentle that she did not want to forget about everything. The man was still as gentle and attentive as on the first night, and in his love, she felt the support that she was so lacking now. 5 years passed, and it seemed that almost nothing had changed in the majestic mansion. The spacious halls and silent corridors still kept other people's secrets. The pen glided confidently across the blank sheet of paper. She was keeping a new diary, completely different from the one that had once burned along with part of her past life. But the courtier who entered was already reminding the Duchess that it was necessary to get ready for dinner. The girl shuddered because she had been so carried away that she had completely forgotten about it. She closed the diary and placed her palm on it for a second. Melly knew she had to hide it so it wouldn't suffer the same fate as the previous one. The girl who had been trying unsuccessfully to become a duchess for 5 years asked for an evening dress suitable for dinner to be brought to her. But Melly's pen had not stopped for a day since then, and now, on the 20th of September, 1956, she was trying to describe the dinner party that had taken place the day before. Edric and she were invited to a formal dinner held at the estate of the Marquise Félicie. The guests were few, and they were all seated in a certain order. That evening, Melly felt unwell. The girl was nauseous, and so the Duchess, overcoming her inner discomfort, covered her mouth with her hand from time to time. But suddenly, an awkward situation occurred. The brunette's spoon, interrupting the chatter of people, fell from the table with a clang, and the Marchioness, who had organized the dinner, covered her mouth with her hands and looked at the pale brunette, already regretting that the girl had not liked the food. Hugging his wife, Edric spoke regretfully about how sorry he was that he was dragging his wife along with him. But Melly was terribly uncomfortable that everyone saw her poor health. Ignoring those present, he continued to gently comfort the girl. But from then on, he no longer took her to official dinners, as if she had been punished. However, on November 4th, 1957, they attended a ball together. There, she was invited to dance by Duke Claudius, And since Melly had absolutely no experience, she accidentally stepped on a man's foot during the dance, miscalculating the movement and embarrassed by what happened. However, he screamed so loudly that he scared the dancers, and as it turned out later, the Duchess's heel, by coincidence, broke the Duke's leg. And the next moment, all eyes were on Edric's wife. And she, feeling the contempt and ridicule, felt how everything inside her turned cold with shame. But the husband, hugging and calming the girl again, said that he would sort out this incident. He quickly picked up the injured Duke and helped him to the living room. However, after that incident, she was never asked to dance again, and the girl began to avoid balls, and time flew inexorably. And in September of 1958, the Duchess went to inspect the enterprise that Edric had asked her to check. She encountered workers who were angry and aggressive over salary delays. They did not mince words when sharply criticizing the girl. Feeling guilty, Melly didn't hesitate to use her own savings to pay off her salary debts. However, it later turned out that they had deceived the brunette. Despite her efforts, the Duchess had little success. And although her husband remained silent, after a while she learned that he had removed her from all affairs of the Felton household. However, Edric still did not lose hope of involving his wife in public life. And already in June of 1959, she was commissioned to hold a historical exhibition, Unskis. But being absent-minded and uncertain of late, she lost the guidebook she had written herself and became a laughingstock among the aristocrats. She didn't understand what was happening to her life, and in April of 1916, she made a grave mistake and didn't send letters to the guests invited to the annual Felton House banquet. When she began to justify herself, the young man, holding the envelope in his hands, offered to transfer the right to hold events to his mother. He looked at his wife condescendingly. It seemed that he was smiling, but there was a coldness about him. But soon the brunette understood its meaning, because it left a bitter aftertaste in Melly's soul. Grabbing the letters in her arms, she quickly followed Edric. But the correspondence fell from her hands onto the floor, like leaves from trees. And the girl realized that in 5 years, her husband had become completely disappointed in her. But after a while, they were invited again to the imperial banquet. The Duke was quickly getting ready, and Melly was rushing to hand her husband his cloak. Looking at his wife and blushing slightly, Edric said that the brunette did not need to be present at this event. She was offended, and the Duchess had already said that she would like to go to the banquet, although there was no confidence in her voice. Now she clearly felt Edric's mother's gaze behind her back, because from the moment of her marriage, she began to address her husband formally, following her advice. In this way, she hoped to show respect for him as the head of the family, not realizing that with each passing year, she was losing something more than just the right to make mistakes. But Edric, throwing on his cloak, was already worried that Melly might overexert herself again. And if she missed the event, no one would dare criticize the Duchess of Felton. Clenching her hand tightly into a fist, Melly understood that in 5 years, she had still not managed to become the woman the Duke wanted to see. And although everything was conducive to success, something inside her constantly prevented the girl from opening up. Sitting on the floor and leaning against the wall, she felt that she had never become the ideal Duchess. She increasingly noticed that Edric relied more on his secretary than on her, and spent a lot of time with him. The man willingly discussed business with him, entrusting him with important assignments, and Melly felt that the guy was gradually replacing her. Turning her head towards her son, the former Duchess asked him to be careful. After all, the lady still felt like the real mistress of the house. Now Melly remembered that initially, Ada was supposed to leave for the southern estate on the orders of her son, but she stayed and proved her indispensability, and the Duchess had no choice but to lower her self-esteem. After all, she considered herself not good enough and could not find an explanation for this. As soon as Edric left the living room, Ada had already allowed the girl to leave the room. Bowing, Melly said goodbye, as if she were a servant. She had no character, was uninteresting, and when Edric left, she was left completely alone. Even the servants had long since ceased to show respect for her. Considering that the brunette was not assigned any tasks, Melly felt completely useless. That's why she returned to her diary more and more often. After all, it was only in it that she could pour out her pain. And now, propping her head up with her hand, she thought bitterly about how she was different from a domestic animal. And this terrible thought caused Melly suffering. But Edric, realizing his wife's helplessness, increasingly told her not to strain herself. However, the girl did not understand how long the Duke would be able to put up with this. As she continued writing, the brunette realized that she was beginning to forget why he had married her in the first place. And words about love had long since disappeared from their conversations. But the next moment, the brunette was distracted by a knock on the door. And with the name Melissa on her lips, the Duke's mother was already bringing her back to reality. Smiling and handing the girl a tray of tea, Ada said that it was time to take her medicine. Quickly rising from her chair, she hurried to meet the woman, complaining that a woman should not carry heavy things. After all, Melly could have gone down to the kitchen. But the former Duchess had already reminded that tea should be drunk regularly. After all, the drink was prescribed by a famous doctor and should contribute to the appearance of an heir. Looking at her reflection on the surface of the tea, Melly doubted that the remedy could help her conceive a child, since 4 years had already passed. But Ada hurried her, saying that she hoped to hear good news by the end of the year. After all, this was the only thing that was expected from the Duchess now. And now the brunette was quietly apologizing again. Looking sideways at her daughter-in-law, the lady reminded her that if she had been more careful and had carried the child to term, the girl would not have had to drink this tea. Stroking her belly, the woman thought about how she had failed to protect her child. But Melly was so afraid of confirmation of infertility that she did not even dare to go to the doctor. Perhaps this is why she became so absent-minded, because all this time she was thinking about the fact that she had not fulfilled her main feminine mission. Quickly drinking a cup of tea, she could not even allow the thought that she would be useless in the matter that seemed her last hope. The girl knew that her husband had always valued only those who were useful, and now she could hardly hide her fear of being outside his interests. After all, Edric always weighed everything carefully. On the scales of his attention, the scale that seemed more advantageous outweighed the other side. And he even left his mother in the mansion only because she was useful. But now the girl could not understand which side of the scale she was on. Melly realized that as a wife, she had not lived up to expectations. After all, she didn't know how to run a house, didn't shine in society, and wasn't ready to become a mother, which meant she wasn't of any value to Edric. Turning away, she hurried to address the former Duchess. And the lady, catching a new intonation in her voice, involuntarily stopped. Covering her mouth with her hand, Melly was already saying that she wanted to attend the banquet at the Imperial Palace. But as always, there was uncertainty in her voice. And the former Duchess, stopping at the door and looking closely at Melly, said that Edric had already left. However, the girl assured that even if she was late, she would still be able to show up at the banquet. She also added that people might find it strange that Edric always came alone. Ada didn't know what to say. She didn't like the idea, but she had no choice but to accept Melly's decision. Quickly disappearing behind the door, the lady declared that she would get busy with preparations. However, she asked the Duchess to wait in her room. And already in the corridor, Ada urgently called the head maid, and she hurried to carry out any orders of the mistress of the Felton's house, even the strangest ones. Speaking about the fact that her daughter-in-law decided to attend today's imperial banquet, she asked to choose a suitable dress for her. However, the woman looked confused. After all, she did not have a new dress for Melly. Fashion had changed, and most of the old outfits no longer suited the Duchess. It seemed that Ada didn't care what her daughter-in-law would look like. The lady said that it was enough to put any dress on her, because without Edric, no one would pay attention to her. Turning away from the maid, the woman added that the dress should be a smaller size, since Melly had recently lost a lot of weight. After that, the servants were already asking about what kind of shoes to choose for her, and the lady asked to choose the highest heels for her daughter-in-law, because she was too short. It seemed as if Ada was deliberately trying to put the brunette in an awkward position, like when she stepped on the young man's foot. To finish the job, she ordered the servants to tell Edric's wife that all the carriages were being repaired, and therefore only the servant's carriage was to be left in the courtyard. As Melly sat in her room awaiting orders, she knew she had to be extremely careful. After all, even the slightest mistake could be in the hands of the Duke's mother. And then she could finally get rid of the girl. The luxurious mansion, where the banquet was held, was noticeable from afar. After all, the lit candles and illuminated windows created a solemn and ceremonial atmosphere. The guests who arrived were talking among themselves, and in the large hall there was a lively laughter that mixed with soft music. At the huge carved gates, decorated with heraldic lilies, stood servants in red waistcoats, and their attention of the guys was already attracted by the cart that drove up to the mansion. It was difficult to call it a carriage, because it was an ordinary battered cart that was used to transport servants and provisions. But the next moment, a beautiful woman was already emerging from it in a dress completely inappropriate for a ball. Looking back, she thanked the cab driver. And the man, coughing and confused from surprise, did not know what to say in response, realizing who he was dealing with. The guards exchanged glances and apologized, but were not going to let the girl into the mansion, doubting her belonging to noble circles. After all, the carriage from which the beauty emerged completely destroyed the idea of her status, and the entrance to the mansion was strictly for invited guests. But Melly was already holding out an invitation, insisting that they let the girl into the banquet. It was noticeable that the young man was slightly confused and even blushed, because the girl surprised him. However, the coat of arms of the Felton house, printed on paper, had already put everything in its place, and the guy asked why the brunette did not immediately say that she was a duchess. The situation seemed so strange that the second servant, coming closer and quickly examining the invitation, ordered that the brunette be let in without delay. The gates of the mansion swung open. Shyly and without raising her head, Melly slowly entered the sparkling hall, filled with the smell of candles and the voices of the guests. The mood was spoiled, after all. She couldn't even imagine that even the guards would allow ridicule towards her. Not a single person showed the slightest interest in her. However, she hoped to find Edric so that she could greet those present with him. But the next moment, the Duchess froze in place, and her faithful little heart sank from what she saw. After all, the Duke was showing off surrounded by young ladies. They were laughing animatedly, and he, apparently, was sharing with them some interesting story, of which he knew quite a few. It was impossible to say for sure whether the Duke enjoyed the company of these women, since he always despised stupidity, but he looked slightly bored. And soon the tall brunette, addressing the Duke by name, noted with delight that she had heard about his work. After all, at a recent meeting, he had proposed several legislative initiatives. Admiring Edric's intelligence and talent, they believed that such people should rule the empire. And the man's appearance and appearance were generally beyond praise. But the next moment, he was talking about how the girls were flattering him. The Duke did not understand how to react to such words from beautiful women. And before the eyes of his dumbfounded wife, he hurried to gallantly kiss the hand of one of the ladies. The blonde was proud of himself and hoped that he would not arouse jealousy in other men. Melly turned around abruptly and intended to leave the banquet. After all, it was unpleasant for her to see her husband courting other ladies. She was angry that she had become a witness to another performance in the person of the aristocracy. Waving her arms, she quickly walked towards the door. However, leaving was not so easy, and very soon someone's ringing. Female voice called out to her, and soon other ladies joined the blonde. They did not mention why they had not seen Melly for so long, and they also noted that the girl avoided such events. Turning around, she greeted them with restraint, noticing that quite a bit of time had passed since their last meeting. Speaking at once, they resembled a flock of birds. But Duchess Felton recalled that none of them had ever invited the brunette to private receptions. However, at some point, the girl realized that they had completely forgotten about her. After all, they had rushed to discuss the new issue of a fashion magazine, which Melly had never heard of. But suddenly the blonde, who had been asking the Duchess not to leave, touching her chin with her finger, said that she had wonderful news. With her arms crossed at the hem of her dress, Melly had already heard that the Marquise Félicie was going to have a third child. However, the other ladies, looking at the Duchess with a smile, said that Countess Lisa was also expecting a second child. And now they were wondering when the Felton couple would have the same news. But she had nothing to say. Hugging herself with her arms, the Duchess was clearly worried. It was obvious they had touched on a sensitive topic. Melly felt her head spinning. People she barely knew were discussing her miscarriage and making assumptions about her infertility. The girl understood that if she didn't leave the banquet now, she would simply lose consciousness and again find herself in an awkward position in front of the public. But she had to stop. After all, behind the girl's back, someone had already sarcastically remarked that such a gray mouse, and with such behavior, would be better off continuing to sit locked up. Clenching her fists in anger, the Duchess realized that she could not go home. After all, she had already tried to meet the changes. But the next moment, turning around and looking straight into the faces of these people, she already remembered that everyone was just waiting for Melly to hide and become useless. Cutting through the crowd, she discreetly thanked the long tongues for the valuable advice. And without wasting time, she resolutely headed towards the man she was interested in. A moment later, she was already standing in front of Duke Claudius. Talking to the young man, he was tasting a new type of wine, enjoying the evening atmosphere. Having bowed in reverence, the beauty boldly began to talk about the fact that she had not seen the Duke for a long time, and hastened to inquire about the man's well-being. He was clearly surprised, and the girl, embarrassing the young man, was already apologizing for the incident at the previous banquet. And now, as compensation, Melly invited him to dance, holding out her hand with such grace as if she had been born for court life. Showing determination, she promised herself that she would begin to correct her previous mistakes so that no one would dare to consider her stupid again. Melly wanted to match the smart and strong husband she loved and felt she had to defend her right to be with him. Meanwhile, Duke Claudius spoke with embarrassment about how his leg had already healed. It was clear that he was flattered by the lady's attention and therefore asked not to worry. However, there was a man in the crowd of guests who kept looking at her. Edric could not understand what made the girl come to the banquet, and at that moment the girl, smiling sincerely, thanked Claudius for his generosity and understanding of the situation. Felton was starting to get angry. After all, he believed that his wife should not have approached another man, violating all the elements of etiquette, but should have approached him first. Breaking away from a crowd of ladies, he slowly but confidently headed towards his wife, catching surprised glances along the way. Coming closer, he asked the Duchess in surprise when she started dancing. Perhaps the girl trained at home and he didn't notice, the Duke added, and now she could even invite other men to dance. But when he was very close, he reproachfully reminded her that a wife should not leave her husband alone at a reception, because he could feel forgotten, and soon Edric was already dragging his wife out onto the balcony. He urgently needed to explain himself to her, and Melly understood that the situation was beyond the ordinary. Categorically stating that he had asked her not to come to the banquet, the man looked at her angrily. But the girl calmly replied that spouses usually attend banquets together. He accused his wife of disgracing him. Not only had Melly put on an outdated dress, the Duke hissed menacingly, but she had also seduced another man. But she just wanted to apologize to the man whose foot she accidentally stepped on. However, Edric sharply reminded her that he had not asked her to do so. His face darkened. Did she really want to ruin his reputation? The man added angrily, allowing himself to arrive at the banquet in a carriage reserved for servants. And then Melly suddenly realized that she hadn't even thought about it. She couldn't explain the situation, and she was desperately looking for an excuse. With her eyes downcast and her fingers clutching the edge of her dress, she said that she had not meant any harm and was only trying to fulfill her duties as a duchess. But at some point, the brunette was already screaming that she just wanted to contribute to their family and help the Duke. After all, she was the Duchess of Felton, not a silent shadow, Melly quietly added, and Edric, putting his hand to his head, only sighed heavily. And the brunette continued to talk about how attending banquets and being with her husband was her duty. And the next moment, he was already wearily asking her to stop being stubborn. After all, everyone had long been accustomed to the fact that his wife could not behave like a real duchess. Melly wanted to say something else in her defense, but Duke Felton, turning sharply, was about to return to the banquet. It seemed that he no longer cared at all what she would do or how she would behave. But she screamed for her husband to wait for her. Lifting her dress, she tried in vain to catch up with him through the stream of surprised people. But the next moment, something happened that had happened to her more than once over the years. And Melly found herself in an awkward situation again. After all, the high heel had treacherously slipped, and the very next moment, at full speed, the Duchess fell straight to the floor. But it seemed that society did not care about her. There was a pulsation in her leg, and the girl was holding back tears with great difficulty. Moreover, sitting on the floor, she heard the guests discussing her, calling her a clumsy duchess. It was obvious that the girl should not have come to such an event. And now the merciless society tormented the beauty with words. The only thought that was pounding in her head was that if she were Duke Felton, she would prefer to hide from shame. But Melly wasn't about to give in. As she picked up her teacup, she thought about how to carefully express her thoughts. After all, the girl, trying to rehabilitate herself after an unfortunate fall, dreamed of organizing a tea party in the Felton mansion. However, Edric's mother noted that this might be too much of a challenge for the Duchess, but Melly was not willing to back down. Of course, the girl understood that her mother-in-law was thinking that she would disgrace herself again. But closing her eyes, she understood that if she did nothing, she would very soon lose Edric completely. Lately, she noticed how her husband, looking at her with indifference, wanted to say that she was useless and good for nothing. She was haunted by his words that over the past 5 years, she should have realized that she had no talent for housekeeping. The servants continued to laugh at her, looking down on her, and all this was because Melly was completely unsuitable for the role of a duchess. Sitting in the office and playing chess, Edric thought about how the brunette had never asked him for help, but he could have intervened and helped his wife. As he rearranged the pieces, the Duke reflected on how he must force his stubborn wife to give in to her attempts to become a duchess. Melly entered the office, holding her jacket in her hands, and asked why the Duke did not want her to do something or learn something. But the man, untying his tie, was already speaking with displeasure about canceling the tea party, noting the futility of the idea. However, the brunette was already indignantly asking why her husband had not consulted her. But he believed that there was no need for this, since he was the main one in this house. And the next moment, he asked his wife not to throw a tantrum. And he also demanded that she stop the behavior that, in his opinion, humiliated both of them. The man was sure that his wife had arranged the tea party not for pleasure, but to prove something to someone. After all, he knew how unpleasant it was for her to communicate with aristocrats. Despite the threats, the brunette was not going to give in. And she was already calmly stating that Edric was right, but she was tired of running away from everything that caused fear and disgust. Coming closer to his wife and calming her down, he said that no one would condemn the Duchess for what she could not do. Stroking the girl's chin, the husband saw love in her gaze, and the brunette thought that she wanted to become the one who was truly right for him. Holding the girl tenderly to himself, the Duke complimented Melly on the inscriptions on the invitations, although he added that it would have been even better if his wife had followed the trends and looked more modern. He quietly recommended that the girl read newspapers in order to understand what was fashionable and popular, and also to develop herself. However, the wife replied that she did not read them only because she did not want to see gossip about her husband, whom she still loved tenderly and devotedly. Touching him, she was already tenderly kissing the man, trying to give him affection and tenderness. Melly asked him to hug her tightly, to feel his love without words, without fears and conditions. However, the next moment, the young man abruptly moved away from the beauty, not wanting to continue. Today, the man noticed that the girl had become bolder, and most likely, he thought, it was because of her loneliness and inner isolation. And the very next minute, the girl was offering her husband to share her bed with her that day. After all, she believed that they should fight for the birth of a future heir, and the time had come to fulfill her duty as a wife. Hearing such words, Edric was indignant. After all, calling what was between them a duty was painful to hear. However, Melly, noticing her husband's reaction, apologized, but added that they really needed a child as a new chance and meaning to their marriage. But the man was already breaking away from the brunette's embrace. Without hiding his irritation, he accused her of being obedient and patient today only in pursuit of her own goals. And now he bitterly asked whether the girl had really waited for him until late, just because she wanted to fulfill this damn duty. He was picky about his words, saying that for her intimacy had now become a duty, not a desire. And in this, she was losing not only herself, but both of them. Breaking down, he said that she needed the child, and not both of them, because in his wife's words, he sensed only consumer interest. Hastily leaving the room, he declared that he was not going to share a bed with her today. Melly's legs couldn't hold her up. She fell to the floor and didn't understand why her husband was angry again, because she just wanted to get closer and be needed. Perhaps the words about duty had really touched his delicate soul. And now she blamed herself for this rude directness that had ruined the evening. It is unclear why, but the girl suddenly remembered how she lost her child 4 years ago. After all, it was then that she began to drink the strange tea that Ada brought. Looking into the filled cup, the brunette was already trying to punish herself for being harsh with her husband. Now the girl understood that she deservedly could not become a mother, And the next moment, Melly quickly poured the contents of the cup into a flower pot. The Duchess did not even imagine how radically she changed her dull life.